They weren't just soldiers. They weren't just guards. They became something far more dangerous. Before the world understood what was happening before the camps, before the war reached its full horror, there was a small group of men, standing quietly behind a rising politician, silent, disciplined, watching. At first, no one paid them much attention. They didn't shout like the others. They didn't riot in the streets. They didn't look like revolution. They looked like order. But that was the illusion, because within less than 2 decades, that same organization would grow into one of the most feared and ruthless machines of control in human history. A force that didn't just follow orders, it defined them. A system that turned ideology into reality and belief into mass destruction. This is the story of how that happened. How a personal bodyguard unit became a state within a state. How loyalty replaced morality. How ordinary men became instruments of something far beyond themselves. And more importantly, how it was allowed to happen. Because the story of the SS is not just about power. It's about transformation. It's about how a broken nation, humiliated and desperate, became the perfect ground for something darker to grow. How fear turned into unity and unity turned into obedience. And how obedience, when taken far enough, can erase the line between duty and evil. This isn't just history. It's a warning. A warning about what happens when people stop questioning. When systems demand loyalty over conscience. When belonging becomes more important than truth. Tonight, we're going to trace that transformation step by step. From the streets of post-war Germany to the inner circle of Adolf Hitler to the machinery of terror that would shock the world. We'll follow the rise of a man who shaped it all from the shadows, Heinrich Himmler. We'll uncover how symbols, rituals, and ideology were used to build absolute control. And we'll step inside a system where obedience wasn't just expected, it was everything. Because the SS was never just an organization, it was an idea. And ideas, once they take hold, are far more dangerous than armies. So before we begin, take a moment. Wherever you are in the world right now and whatever time it is, just imagine this. A cold morning. Munich, early 1920s. The war is over, but nothing feels finished. The streets are quiet, but beneath that silence, something is waiting. And in that silence, a movement is about to begin. They were born in ceremony, baptized in loyalty, and bound by blood to a single man, the Schutzstaffel. The SS began not as an army, but as a bodyguard, a small circle sworn to protect Adolf Hitler. Yet within a few short years, it became something far greater and infinitely more terrible. From its polished black uniforms to its runic insignia, the SS projected an image of order, strength, and destiny. But behind the facade lay a machinery of control and destruction that would come to define the darkest chapters of 20th century. The SS was more than a military force. It was a state within a state, an empire of ideology, terror, and absolute obedience. To understand the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, one must descend into the shadow world of the SS, where loyalty eclipsed morality and discipline masked damnation. His story began in 1925. In the chaotic aftermath of the First World War, Germany was broken, humiliated by defeat, strangled by debt, and burning with resentment. Amid this turmoil emerged a movement that promised rebirth, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At its center stood Adolf Hitler, a failed artist turned all who wielded words like weapons. He needed protection, men who would guard him not only from bullets but from dissent. The first members of the SS numbered barely 100. They were selected not for skill but for devotion. Men who would stand immovable between their Führer and the world. They wore black, marched with precision, and swore oaths not to Germany, not to the army, but to Hitler himself. In those early years, the SS was little more than a ceremonial shield. Yet within that oath lay the seed of future tyranny. When Hitler seized power in 1933, the SS found its true purpose under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, a quiet, meticulous man with a fanatic's heart. It evolved into a force unlike any other. Himmler envisioned the SS as a racial elite, the purest embodiment of Nazi ideology, destined to shape the future of the Reich. He built a hierarchy rooted in pseudoscience and myth, blending Aryan folklore, genetics, and bureaucratic precision into a chilling doctrine of superiority. The SS would control not just the security of the state, but its very soul. Within years, its reach extended into every corner of German life, from policing and intelligence to colonization and extermination. It was both sword and shield, executing Hitler's will with ruthless efficiency and unwavering faith. The SS divided itself into branches, each serving a unique role. The machinery of power, the Allgemeine SS, oversaw racial policy, propaganda, and administration. The Sicherheitsdienst or SD acted as the intelligence arm, the eyes and ears of the Reich. The Gestapo, its secret police, crushed opposition and filled the prisons. And then came the Waffen-SS, the military wing, soldiers who fought alongside the Wehrmacht, yet answered only to Himmler. They were trained to see themselves not merely as warriors, but as guardians of an ideological destiny. From Poland to the steppes of Russia, they fought with fierce discipline and unwavering brutality, earning a reputation for both courage and cruelty. Beneath their polished discipline lay a fanatical devotion and a capacity for atrocities unmatched in modern war. But the darkest realm of SS lay beyond the battlefield. It was the SS that built and administered the concentration camps, a system that began as imprisonment and ended in annihilation. Under the direction of the SS Totenkopf Verbände, millions were enslaved, tortured, and exterminated. The SS became the architect and executive of the final solution, transforming ideology into genocide with industrial efficiency. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Soiber. These were not military targets. They were factors of death operated with bureaucratic precision by men who once swore oaths of honor. The SS blurred the line between soldier and executioner, between belief and barbarism. It became the embodiment of organized evil, not chaos but control, not rage but calculation. As the war turned against Germany, the SS grew even more desperate, clinging to its myths of purity and sacrifice. Its soldiers fought to the last in Berlin, still loyal to the dream that had long since turned to dust. Even as the Reich collapsed, Himmler spoke of rebuilding, of retreating into the mountains to begin anew. But the dream was dead, and the world was watching. When the Allied forces liberated the camps, they uncovered the full horror of what the SS had done. The black uniforms that once commanded fear now symbolized infamy. Himmler took his own life. The SS was declared a criminal organization, its members hunted and tried, yet its shadow lingered in ruins, in memory, and in the eternal question of how ordinary men became instruments of inhumanity. The story of the shuttle is not simply a chronicle of war or ideology. It is a warning carved into history. It shows how devotion can become domination, how order can conceal atrocity, and how belief, when stripped of conscience, can destroy entire civilizations. The SS was not born monstrous. It was built by men piece by piece, oath by oath, until there was nothing left of the human beneath the uniform. Tonight, we journey into that darkness, through the marble halls and death camps, the parades and the prisons, the myth and the madness to uncover the rise, the power, and the ruin of Hitler's elite guard. This is the entire story of Schutzstaffel, the SS, from its ceremonial birth to its catastrophic end. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? In the chill of a Bavarian morning, the fog rolled low over Munich's broken streets. The Great War had ended, but its echo still lingered in every alley and courtyard. Brick and plaster clung to damaged buildings like old wounds refusing to heal. The air smelled of coal smoke and hunger. Men in threadbare uniforms walked aimlessly, medals dull against their coats, their faces hollow from loss and disillusion. Germany's empire had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles had taken not only land and wealth, but also identity. Inflation eroded what little people had left, and bitterness became the only currency that held its
Hitler's
value.
imprisonment
became an easy silence,
not an end.
Resentment waited
From his cell,
patiently for someone to give it form.
Planned.
The city,
and those who
restless
believed in him waited.
When
ready
he
to
emerged,
listen to any voice
they followed
that
again. But
promised
this time
purpose.
was more
Among those
discipline
voices
and less
was
doubt.
a former
What had
corporal who
been
carried
a
the
whisper
memory
of vengeance
of the
now
trenches
began
like a
to
medal unseen.
echo as
Adolf
certainty.
Hitler,
Still
loyalty
more
was
agitated
refined, then
into ritual.
leader,
Began
obedience
speaking
into
in smoky
creed,
taverns,
and
where
each
soldiers
man who
gathered
wore
to
the black
complain
uniform
of
felt
betrayal
the
and
comfort
lost
of
pride.
belonging to
His
something
words were simple,
larger than
but their
himself.
rhythm
The
matched
uniform
the bitterness in the
promised
room.
identity.
Each phrase
Promised
resurrected the war,
meaning,
not as
the cost of
defeat,
that meaning,
but as
though
injustice
unseen,
was
he
already
spoke of
taking shape.
enemies within,
Every movement
of
built on
betrayal
resentment
by
must
politicians
find
and
an enemy to
financiers
sustain
of a
itself.
nation.
For
For
the
low by weakness,
growing SS,
for men,
that enemy was
accustomed to
everywhere
order
in
and comradeship,
ideology,
his
in race,
certainty was
in
magnetic.
conspiracies.
The
Fear
structure
became
of command,
fuel, and
he offered
unity. It again
its
in the
disguise.
language of destiny.
In the quiet
In
offices of
beer
party,
halls dim with cigarette
headquarters,
smoke, new roles
the
were defined.
future
and
began to
loyalty
take
tests
shape
became
out of
sacred.
anger.
And
Each
myth, man's
hope
faith
and
was
hatred
measured
found
not by
themselves
compassion
spoken
in the same breath,
but by his
and
willingness
no one seemed to notice the
obey.
danger.
Those who
hesitated by
were replaced.
1920,
Those who
a
followed
movement
without question
was forming,
were
not yet
rewarded.
powerful.
But
The machinery of
disciplined,
fanaticism,
patience,
was assembling
and growing.
itself one
There
chord at a time.
men who gathered
even
around
as most
him
of
were
its
not
builders
yet
believed,
the black-clad
they were
symbols
symbols of
of
fear.
honor.
They
By
would
the winter
later
of
become
1923,
they were veterans.
The fog that
laborers
once cloaked
and
Munich
students
seemed
drawn together
to have settled
by
into its
exhaustion
very
and
spirit.
pride.
The
They had
war-scarred
known
veteran
only
who
two
had
conditions.
searched
For
for and
belonging
defeat.
had found it.
Many had
but in
come
a
home to
cause that
find their
demanded the
families
surrender of
hungry and their
conscience.
ideals.
The
Shattered.
taverns that had once
The new democracy
murmured of betrayal
fragile
now echoed
and
with
divided.
chance of
Seemed
unity,
incapable. The
of
quiet guards
restoring
who
what had been
had
lost.
once stood at the back
They
of
found
rallies.
in
Now
Hitler's
embodied the
rhetoric a
order
mirror
that the
for
movement,
their
anger
great
and a promise of
defeat
renewal
had been
to
remade
them
into
the idea of
destiny,
a purified nation
and despair
was
had
not
learned to
yet about
march.
conquest,
History
but
was
about
beginning
cleansing.
again.
Not
Humiliation
with
through
clarity,
unity and
but with
obedience.
conviction.
They
And
began to see
somewhere
themselves
between the
as
silence of
guardians of that
obedience
future
and the
men
noise of
chosen
rhetoric.
to
Restore order
single
to
truth
chaos.
waited to be
It
learned.
was not yet
too. Evil in
late.
their minds.
In a
It was
wounded
city,
purpose,
a whisper
found
in a world stripped
its
of
echo and
certainty.
began to march.
Purpose was
by the
irresistible.
middle of
As
the
the years
1920s,
turned,
a
Germany
small
was a
group
nation
calling
between
itself
two. The
Shadow,
National Socialist
the memory
German
of
workers,
defeat and the
party grew
rumor
more
of
organized.
resurgence. The
Uniforms
economy
flickered
appeared,
between
first
bursts of
simple,
promise,
then
and
symbolic,
relapse into
flags
despair.
replaced
In this
conversations,
unsettled
salutes,
the Nazi
replaced
movement
doubts.
began to
Within
rebuild
the movement
itself after the failure
special
of the
guard
Munich
began to form.
push. A small
Hitler,
released
circle of
from
men
prison
sworn
and
to
more
protect their
cautious
leader with their
sought
lives.
not only followers,
They were few,
but disciplined
guardians
and
men
chosen
whose
for
loyalty
loyalty
would be
above
personal,
all else,
unbreakable.
they called
and
themselves
pure.
out
The
of
Schutzstaffel,
this desire
the
came
protection
the early
squadron.
form of the
At first they were
Schutzstaffel,
little more than
still
a
small
ceremonial
still
guard,
uncertain,
men who stood
but
behind,
already different in
speaker
tone
on makeshift
from the
stages,
unruly
but
brown
their
shirts who filled
silence gave them
the
weight.
streets, and
They were not to
presence
shout,
lent an air
but
of permanence
to stand.
Movement
They were not
still
to
half
swagger,
in shadow,
but
in a time
to serve.
of noise
Their
and chaos.
silence was their
quiet
language,
uniformity
and their
felt
uniform
like
was
control.
there.
The
Armor,
city within
itself
the party
became a stage
the
for
SS
transformation.
barely noticed
Marches
at first.
replaced rallies
A minor
and symbols.
detachment
Replaced
in a movement
arguments,
crowded with
propaganda
militias.
flooded.
Yet
Streets
even then,
and taverns alike,
something about
promising its
revival
discipline
through
attention,
unity
in
and
the
strength,
calm precision of
beneath
its
the
bearing,
spectacle
ran
the
a darker
future
character of far
resentment
darker
feeding discipline.
institution
Discipline
was already
hardening
taking
into
shape.
belief.
Among those
What
drawn to this
had
new
started
order
as a club
was
for
Heinrich
the
Himmler, a man of
disillusion
quiet
began
ambition
to resemble a
and
state
inward certainty.
within a state.
He had been raised
The beer hall
on a
PCH
small farm in
of
Bavaria,
1923
by the
was the
measured
first
rhythm of
attempt
work
to turn
and
faith into
rituals of
force.
faith. The
It
war
failed,
had ended,
collapsing in
before he could
confusion
serve,
and
but not
gunfire,
before it. And the
had marked
streets
him with longing.
of Munich
A
fell
wish to
silent once
belong
more.
to something
But
larger.
ideas
Something
do not die with
that gave
defeat.
purpose to
They
obedience.
retreat.
He studied
They wait.
agriculture
They
and
reorganize.
biology.
Fascinated by
Whispers
ideas that had
blood,
filled taverns,
soil,
wood, and
return
renewal.
louder,
The
steadier,
defeat of
and
Germany
far
became
more dangerous
in his mind,
for
for the
moral
young
and
men
spiritual.
who had joined
Failure
the
rather
SS
than
in those
military
early
wars.
years.
Himmler's faith
Failure
drifted
was
from
not
the church
discouragement
to the
It was
mythology of
baptism.
race and nation.
They saw in the
He
blood,
believed that
spilled on
purity
Munich
was not a
streets
metaphor,
sign but a law
their
of
cause
nature.
had been tested,
By the time
and
he joined the
survived.
Nazi party, he had already built an inner world where discipline could heal chaos and devotion could replace doubt. In a movement crowded with loud men, his calm was his weapon. He rose not through force of will, but through the precision of his belief. The SS became his project, a canvas for order in a world he saw as contaminated. He began to record everything: names, ranks, lineage, duties, habits. The pen became his instrument of power long before he commanded men in the field. Under his influence, the SS ceased to be a mere bodyguard and began to evolve into a sacred fellowship. Membership was limited, and loyalty was tested. Each man swore not to the nation or the state, but to Hitler himself. Oaths were spoken softly beneath banners, their weight resting more heavily than the uniforms they wore. In Himmler's notebooks, words like obedience, faith, and duty appeared not as virtues, but as absolutes. The SS was to be conscious of the movement, disciplined, where others were chaotic, spiritual, where others were political. Their image was sharpened until even their silence seemed to declare conviction. Within a few years, the detachment had turned into an idea that loyalty was not merely a command, but a creed. The wider party soon learned to rely on that creed. Hitler's rise required spectacle and violence, but it also demanded control. The stormtroopers, the Tsar, were too wild, too impulsive, too easily corrupted by street power. The SS, by contrast, offered precision. They guarded meetings, vetted members, and maintained order where the others created noise. Under Himmler's direction, they cultivated an image of moral superiority, clean, upright, and smiling. They were taught that the movement would survive only if its protectors remained unblemished by greed or emotion. Their uniform became a second skin, the oath, heartbeat. As their numbers grew, so did their sense of separation from the ordinary. They were not many, but they believed themselves essential. Within that belief lay the seed of every cruelty that would follow. Himmler understood that symbols mattered as much as strength. The color black chosen for their uniforms was no accident. It stood for discipline, mystery, and fear. The runes stitched onto collars, the death's head on the cap. These were not decorations, but declarations. Each element carried meaning, binding the men to an imagined lineage, stretching back into myth, to where the uniform was to inherit that myth and to surrender individuality in exchange for belonging. Even the simplest gesture, the tightening of a glove or the adjustment of a belt, became ritual.
That
To the
blood
outside
could record the worth
world,
of
the
people
SS
as
looked
clearly
like a
as history
ceremonial
could
guard
record
to
their
those
deeds.
within. To him,
felt like
the
a
failures
priesthood of
the
faith
present
and
were
power.
symptoms of
They had
contamination,
turned politics
and
into
the cure
liturgy
was
and purification,
obedience into
not
devotion,
of ideas,
beneath
but
the
of pageantry.
bodies.
Belief
Belief
had
had
hardened
gathered
into
of
identity.
pseudo-scientists
The
and
ideology
antiquarians
that guided
who
them shared
was
his
built on
obsession.
illusion.
They measured
The illusion of
skulls,
purity,
traced family
of
lines,
unity,
and of moral
collected
strength.
myths as if they
Himmler
were
saw in
evidence,
the SS a
in
chance to
offices
create
that smelled of
a
ink
new kind of
and
human being.
formaldehyde,
One untouched,
charts were drawn
by
to
weakness,
prove that
cleansed of
virtue was
doubt,
hereditary.
discipline
The
to the point of
language
worship.
of medicine
Recruitment
became the
was
language
selective and
of
invasive,
destiny,
where
demanding
science
proof
ended,
of ancestry
mythology
and
began.
fitness.
Every
And in the
file was a
spaces
scripture.
between the
Bloodlines,
two, belief found
in
its
these archives,
justification.
humanity
The SS
was
became
rewritten
the
as
vessel
hierarchy
for this new
and
order of thinking.
prejudice was given the
Recruitment
language
was no
of
longer about loyalty.
science
The
alone,
SS was
but
becoming
lineage.
both myth
Applicants
and
were
bureaucracy,
required to
a
prove
place
their
where
ancestry
mysticism and
to
paperwork
produce
could
documents
coexist
that confirmed
to its
racial
members.
worth
This
according to the standards
merging
of
of
the
a
spiritual
system
and
built on fantasy.
administrative
gave
files
their
grew
work
thicker.
a sacred
Photographs
flavor.
were They were
catalogued
taught that to
and
serve
archives
was to
expanded with
sanctify meticulous
and that
devotion
devotion
of what had
obedient
begun as
strength
a
and the nation
God now aspired
in
to be a brotherhood,
reality.
purified
Each
by
act simply
design.
deepened
Himmler
the
spoke of
machinery of
creating
control,
a new
while
nobility,
the Tsar
a modern,
filled the streets,
knightly class
the
born of
SS
German
waited,
blood.
and
They, devoted
in
to
silence,
racial resurrection,
recorded their
his ranks,
fascination with
refined
the
their
medieval
doctrine,
past.
their
The
rules,
leader spoke
the
less of
rituals,
politics
the
and more
imagined
of destiny.
grandeur offered
Under
the
his
movement.
guidance,
Mythology
the
to match its
organization
ambition
became a
It
mirror
was
of his
a myth draped in
mind,
uniforms
orderly
and sanctified
meticulous, and
by
convinced
procedure of its
men
own
began to
righteousness.
believe not
The
only
men
in
who
their leader,
him
but
began
in
to
their
believe that
supposed
history
lineage,
itself obeyed
identity
laws
became
and that they were
worship
its
and biology
chosen
became
instruments.
in
Loyalty replaced
this atmosphere of
morality
obsession.
and structure
Institutions
replaced
were created to make
conscience.
those
Ideology
intangible
tangible were
the race and
seen not as
settlement
individuals
office
but
was
as
established.
impurities to be
regulate
removed.
who could marry,
This was not
who could
yet terror
serve,
but
and
its
who could
foundations
belong.
had been
It turned
laid.
personal
When the
life
time
into
came to
policy.
act, love
Hesitation
into
would already have
legislation.
been
Trained
Couples
out
were
of them.
examined
What
as
had
if their
once been
unions. Discipline was now
experiments.
submission
Their
disguised
children,
as
envisioned as instruments
end
of
of the
renewal.
decade.
Marriage
The SS
certificates
stood apart
became
even
symbols
within
of
the Nazi
loyalty to the
movement.
cause and the family.
Their ranks were small,
itself was
but
recast as
their
a tool
reputation
of the
vast.
state.
The black
Himmler's vision of
uniforms had
purity
become symbols of
extended
something
even to birth.
greater than
The
force.
next symbols
generation was to be
conviction,
designed purity,
merely
and
born.
unyielding. In his eyes,
Faith.
the
They
SS
guarded
was
Hitler,
not
marched
just a
at
military body,
rallies,
but a
and
biological
represented the image of a
vanguard breeding
new
the
Germany
future
rising
he
from
imagined
humiliation
into existence.
Every
Beneath
oath,
the steel of their
every
loyalty,
form, layer,
every
fragile
ceremony,
truth,
reinforced the
structure
illusion
they
that destiny
worshipped would soon
could be
become a
engineered.
machine.
It
And
was
the
a
men
faith
who swore to
without
serve
mercy
would
become
and
its
its
altar
cogs,
was the
oath
human
that had
genome,
once, as the
felt
movement
sacred
grew,
would bind them
the
not
myth-demanded
virtue,
monuments,
but to
Wilsberg,
destruction.
castle
And
perched
as
on a
their
hill in
leaders'
Westphalia,
ambitions grew,
became the heart of
so
this
too
new
did the
religion.
shadow
of
they cast.
Race,
What began
Himmler
as a
saw in
guard
its stone walls,
became a creed,
sanctuary
and
for the
creeds
faith
are harder
he had built
to
kill than men.
place where
By
history,
the early
mysticism,
1930s,
and
Germany's despair
ideology
was being
could
converged
into
Scholars
doctrine.
were sent to
The
decorate
nation
it
was still
with
staggering
symbols
under the
drawn
weight
from
of
runes,
depression,
astrology,
its streets
and
filled with
medieval
jobless
heraldry
men and
within
hollow
its
slogans.
halls.
The
Yet,
SS
amid
would
the
hold
chaos,
rituals of
the Nazi
initiation
party
and
was
renewal,
learning to harness
torches
emotion
burned
as
oaths,
organization
were repeated in
speeches
unison,
became
giving the
ceremonies,
illusion of
symbols
ancient
replaced
continuity
arguments.
to a modern
every
invention.
public event was
Here,
designed
the past
to
was
evoke
rewritten
unity
to serve
where
the
only
future,
fracture
and had
superstition
existed.
wore the mask
The
of
SS,
heritage. Small
the
but
castle
growing,
became a shrine
stood
to
apart
control,
as a disciplined force,
fortress
in
of imagination,
this rising tide,
where myth
they did not
disguised
chant,
the machinery
they
of
observed,
power, for
they did not improvise.
It
They
was proof
performed
that
with
belief
precision.
could
To them,
be built into
belief
stone.
was not an accessory.
Beyond the castles,
It was
walls,
structure
that
itself.
belief found its
And
expression
in this time of
in the lives
confusion,
of ordinary Germans.
Heinrich Himmler was
Propaganda
quietly
posters filled the
defining
streets
what that structure
with
would
idealized
mean,
faces,
while others
blonde,
dreamed of
strong,
power. He
symmetrical,
dreamed of
reflections
purity.
of a
Himmler's
nation.
imagination
Imagined
was a
not
peculiar
real.
blend
In
of modern
classrooms,
science. Teachers
and medieval
recited
faith.
lessons on
He
racial
read biology,
hierarchy as if
where
they
a
were
priest
lessons
reads scripture,
in
researching
arithmetic, in
for moral
hospitals,
law within the
doctors
anatomy of
applied
man.
the
He was
language of
fascinated by
hygiene
its
to human worth. The
state had
found its new trinity: race, order, and obedience. Each citizen was asked not only to live under this system, but to embody it,
Those who did not fit were marked as errors to be corrected, lives to be removed quietly in the name of progress. The logic was clear and merciless. Once purity became virtue, exclusion became moral duty. Once belief governed biology, compassion was no longer compatible with loyalty. Himmler's world was one of precision, yet beneath its surface ran a profound insecurity. The need to measure, to classify, to sanctify each action betrayed a constant fear of imperfection. His obsession with control revealed its opposite, a terror of disorder. Each ritual, each ceremony, was an attempt to impose meaning on a universe that refused to conform. In his diaries and memoranda, he wrote of destiny as if it were a formula that could be solved. The men around him mirrored this mindset, replacing curiosity with conviction and doubt with duty. Their science became superstition, their morality a machine. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, this fusion of ideology and control had hardened into a system. The SS was now more than loyal. It was convinced. When the flag of the new Reich rose over Germany, it was not only a political triumph, but a spiritual one for those who believed in the SS creed. They saw themselves as the chosen few, standing at the threshold of a new world. In their hands, myth had become method, and faith had become governance. The same hands that had once measured skulls now wrote laws. The system that had begun as fantasy would soon shape the fates of millions. It was an order built on conviction, but sustained by fear, a vision that could not tolerate the imperfect or the different. And as Himmler's empire expanded, its faith deepened into fanaticism. What had begun in candlelight and parchment would soon find its echo in fire and ruin. Belief became ritual, ritual became rule. In the summer of 1934, Germany stood on the edge of transformation, disguised as stability. The Nazi movement had taken power the year before. Its banners now a permanent part of public life. The streets that once echoed with protest were quiet, though the quiet had a weight to it, a waiting kind of silence. The stormtroopers, the so who had carried the early revolution on their backs, now grew restless with victory. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted more, a second revolution, one that would dissolve the old order entirely and put the army beneath his control. To Adolf Hitler, now Chancellor, that ambition was intolerable. He needed loyalty, not rivalry, between the brown shirts who had built the movement and the black-clad SS who guarded it. The balance of power was shifting. The SS, smaller but disciplined, represented not chaos, but control. Their leader, Heinrich Himmler, saw in the coming crisis an opportunity to prove the value of obedience over passion. And in a system that prized loyalty above life, proof would come in blood. The tension gathered like a storm over Berlin and Munich. Rumors traveled through offices and barracks that the Tsar was plotting, that arrests were imminent, that lists were being prepared. In reality, the lists were already written. Hitler's circle, including Goering and Himmler, had conspired to remove the threat that Rome's independence posed. The Tsar's ranks, vast and unpredictable, were to be broken in a single decisive night. The SS was chosen to act. The very men who once stood beside their Tsar comrades in rallies and marches, orders were given in quiet tones, through sealed messages and discreet meetings. Each man was told only what he needed to know, and each understood without question that the command came from the highest level. The air in the barracks grew heavy, the way air grows before thunder. Men cleaned their pistols with mechanical care, avoiding each other's eyes. They told themselves it was duty. They told themselves it was necessary. They told themselves it was loyalty. When the night came, it brought rain. It fell softly at first, tracing lines down the windows of offices and cars. Waiting in the dark, engines idled in courtyards, their headlights covered. The SS men moved in small units, their boots muffled against wet cobblestones. They had been told who to find, where to go, and what to do when they arrived. Many of the names on their lists were men they knew. Some had shared meals, others had fought in the same streets during the rise to power, but the past no longer mattered. Orders were to be obeyed without hesitation. Across Germany, arrests began in the small hours of the morning, at hotels, country retreats, and apartments. Doors were knocked upon or broken down. The rain disguised the noise, and the city, as always, remained indifferent. It was a night without speeches, without witnesses, without forgiveness. Inside the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, phones rang in careful rhythm. Reports came in from every province confirming targets found, executions completed, prisoners transferred. The efficiency of the system was its own reassurance. Each call represented one more step toward consolidation. Hitler himself in Munich personally confronted Rome in his cell before leaving the rest to his subordinates. By dawn, the Tsar leadership was shattered. Those who survived were stripped of power and humiliated before being replaced by men who understood what silence was worth. For the SS, the night was not a moral struggle. It was a test of reliability. They passed Himmler's Black Order, had proven what the SA could not. That obedience was stronger than emotion. That loyalty required no explanation. The act of killing one's own comrades had burned away doubt. What remained was a brotherhood bound not by friendship, but by fear and faith. The consequences reached far beyond the bloodshed. In the aftermath, the German army, once wary of the Nazi militias, gave its allegiance to Hitler, reassured that discipline had prevailed over disorder. The SS was no longer a ceremonial guard. It had become a pillar of the new state. Himmler expanded his authority over police and intelligence, turning the organization into a machine of internal control. Files were opened on citizens, officers, even ministers. Withy in months, the SS would oversee not only security, but ideology. The black uniform, once symbolic of devotion, now carried the weight of power itself. Within its folds, men could act with impunity, their conscience replaced by command. The night of the long knives, as it would come to be called, was the crucible that defined the new Germany. The lesson was simple and lasting. Survival belonged to those who obeyed. For the men who pulled the triggers, the memory of that night never left. Some spoke of it years later, in tones of justification, others with an ease that surfaced only in solitude. They told themselves it had been necessary to save the nation, that history demanded sacrifice. Yet even those who believed that story could not completely quiet the echo of what they had done. A few were haunted by the faces they recognized in the dark, by the sound of rain mixing with gunfire. They had acted without hesitation, as trained, but the silence afterward was harder to endure than the orders themselves. In the years that followed, many would claim they were instruments, not authors. That distinction, repeated endlessly, would become the moral defense of an entire generation of functionaries. The burden of obedience had shifted from personal choice to collective ritual. In the calm that followed, the SS began to refine itself even further. Promotions were granted, ceremonies held, and the narrative of the purge rewritten as heroism.
Propaganda presented the SS as saviors of order, protectors of the Führer, the moral heart of the movement. Within their ranks, there was pride, but also distance. The organization that once stood for loyalty had become loyalty itself. Stripped of purpose beyond service, men learned to admire precision, not mercy, structure, not conscience. Their humanity was replaced by efficiency. The moral language of the individual was gradually erased, and replaced with the vocabulary of the institution. That transformation, quiet, methodical, and complete, was the true legacy of 1934. The Black Order had stepped out of the shadows and into authority. By the end of that year, Germany was no longer a nation of competing factions, but a single structure ruled through fear and faith. The SS stood at its center, the embodiment of disciplined devotion. What had begun as a personal guard had become a parallel government, a state within a state. Its members wore their silence like armor, and their obedience like prayer. The regime had learned that the Chest loyalty is born not from love, but from fear of disobedience. That night of rain and blood had rewritten the moral code of a generation. Power had proven itself through its willingness to destroy its own. And as the engines cooled and the corridors emptied, only one truth remained, unspoken, but understood. Loyalty, they learned, was measured not in words, but in silence after the gunfire. By the middle of the 1930s, the SS had begun to move beyond its ceremonial purpose and into the bloodstream of the German state. Its black uniformed members were no longer confined to rallies or parades. They now filled offices, police stations, and administrative posts, quietly replacing the old order of civil servants. The transformation was slow, deliberate, and bureaucratic rather than violent. What had once been a movement of emotion became an institution of regulation. The tools of this new authority were not rifles and speeches, but paper, pens, and stamps. Behind every decree stood a desk, and behind every desk a man who believed he was simply doing his job. In the measured rhythm of typing and filing, a new form of control took shape, impersonal, efficient, and nearly invisible. Germany was not ruled from shouting crowds anymore, but from quiet rooms where words replaced weapons. The machinery of terror began to humbly at first, but steadily. Like an engine built to run without pause, Heinrich Himmler envisioned the SS as the moral and administrative backbone of the new Reich. To him, order was not only political but spiritual, and every system that reinforced obedience became sacred. The creation of the Gestapo, the secret state police, was his most powerful step toward this vision. Its purpose was to ensure that loyalty extended into thought, that suspicion became a form of duty. The Gestapo worked in silence, relying on reports from neighbors, co-workers, even family members. Fear spread not through explosions of violence, but through whispers. People learned to monitor their own words, their own gestures. Files accumulated on desks, documenting private lives with bureaucratic precision. The SS did not need to shout to dominate. It merely recorded. And in that recording, it transformed humanity into documentation. Something that could be categorized, retrieved, and erased. The state became both the watcher and the watched. At the same time, the first concentration camps began to take form. Dachau, established in 1933, became the prototype for a system that would expand quietly across Germany. Officially described as centers for re-education and protective custody, they were laboratories of discipline designed to demonstrate what resistance cost. Guards were trained to treat cruelty as administration, punishment as paperwork. Behind the barbed wire, prisoners were stripped not only of freedom, but of identity. Each name was replaced by a number, each man by a file. For the SS, this was not barbarism, it was method. Every beating, every order, every death was logged with the same formality as a shipment or a repair request. The guards were told they were maintaining order, preserving the health of the nation. And many believed it because the structure around them made belief easy. Obedience had been institutionalized. The bureaucratic side of the SS expanded in step with its physical control. Officers multiplied in Berlin,
Munich, and across occupied territories. Divisions were created for racial policy, population management, and intelligence. In each office, typewriters clattered like mechanical hearts, beating out the pulse of regulation. The men who filled these positions were educated, polite, and often unimaginative. They spoke of files, not faces, of categories, not people. Their detachment became their strength. The violence of the state no longer required emotion. It required only efficiency. Within this order, moral responsibility dissolved into procedure. A single form could condemn a family. A single signature could alter a life. The greater the system grew, the smaller the individual conscience became. And that was its genius and its horror. Himmler's influence reached beyond policing into every branch of German life. The racial laws of 1935 announced in Nuremberg codified the SS worldview into national policy. These laws defined who was German, who was not, and who would never be again. Marriage, citizenship, and employment were suddenly governed by ancestry charts and bureaucratic tests of blood. Scientists and clerks worked together to trace family trees, transforming prejudice into paperwork. Across the country, people were measured and classified with the same detached accuracy used for livestock. The ideology of purity had become a civil registry. To most citizens, it arrived not as violence, but as paperwork stamped with official seals. Behind those seals was the quiet conviction that order justified all things. The SS had succeeded in turning faith into formality. The structure of control became self-sustaining. Each new regulation created new offices to enforce it. Each office required more personnel. Each department justified its own existence by extending its reach. Fear was the fuel that kept it running. Those inside the system worked harder, not only to serve the state, but to protect themselves from it. A misplaced report or a missing file could draw attention, and attention could destroy a career or a life. Bureaucrats learned to obey not just orders, but expectations. The result was a machinery that required no visible cruelty to function, yet produced it as a matter of routine. The men and women within it rarely saw the full consequence of their work. They saw documents, not the people they described. In the calm of office hours, the boundaries between duty and complicity blurred. For those who served as guards, clerks, and informants, the rhythm of cruelty became ordinary. Days began with roll calls, and ended with reports. Orders were followed, boxes checked, forms filed. The system's genius lay in its ability to turn moral decisions into mechanical tasks. Architecture of terror no longer needed anger to operate. It needed only compliance. People who might never have lifted a weapon became essential components of repression. The sound of violence was no longer the roar of the crowd. It was the steady hum of routine. In this way, the SS built an empire of control, not through spectacle, but through monotony. The terror it spread was not loud, but constant, like the ticking of a clock that no one could stop. By 1938, the SS had completed its transformation from a bodyguard to a bureaucracy of fear. Its officers commanded the police, its agents filled the intelligence services, and its ideology defined the law. The system no longer required belief in its justice, only participation in its function. The line between obedience and evil had dissolved into paperwork. For the men in the offices, the ink on the page was their only weapon. Yet, it proved as deadly as any bullet. The regime had discovered that control could be clean, quiet, and total. No grand speeches were necessary, no crowds required. The nation moved according to the rhythm of administrative certainty. The machine of terror needed no roar, only paper, ink, and quiet efficiency. By 1938, the SS was no longer merely an organization, it was an order. The years of expansion had given it wealth, authority, and prestige. But what bound its members most deeply was not power. It was belief in a nation remade by ideology. The SS fashioned itself into something beyond politics, something sacred. It promised its members that they were not just
soldiers, but guardians of destiny. The oath they swore was not to a flag or a constitution, but to a man, and through him to an idea. That idea was purity of blood, of spirit, of will, to serve in. The SS was to step out of the ordinary and into the mythic. In its rituals, discipline met devotion. Uniforms became vestments. Service became sacrament. The young men who entered its ranks did so with pride, not yet seeing how belief could be used to bind as tightly as fear. In the glow of torchlight and the echo of vows, they mistook reverence for righteousness. The ideology of purity had become the faith of an empire. Himmler, now at the height of his influence, cultivated that faith with care. He envisioned the SS as a modern, knightly order, heirs to the Teutonic past, and guardians of the German future. History was rewritten as theology. Race became destiny. In his writings and speeches, Himmler spoke of honor and blood as though they were interchangeable. To him, the SS was not just a military elite, but the seed of a new civilization. He built schools to train its future leaders, not in tactics or strategy alone, but in ritual, genealogy, and myth. Lessons mixed science with superstition, teaching recruits that they carried the spiritual inheritance of a superior race. These were not simply soldiers learning to fight. They were initiates learning to believe. The mind once filled with curiosity was slowly narrowed to a single line of thought, that service to the order was service to the eternal. At Welsburg Castle, this belief took physical form. The old fortress in Westphalia was restored as the ceremonial heart of the SS, a place where myth could be made tangible. Its halls were redesigned to reflect symbols drawn from runes and astrology, a mirror of Himmler's fascination with the mystical past. Their initiations were held under torchlight, each ceremony steeped in solemnity. The men chosen to attend were the most loyal, the most obedient, the most pure by the standards of their order. They stood in silence, hearing their vows echo off the stone, as if history itself bore witness. The air was thick with the weight of purpose, and each man felt that he was part of something vast and enduring. A ring engraved with symbols of death and rebirth was placed upon his hand, a reminder that service to the order was both an honor and a surrender. The ritual promised eternity, but what it demanded was obedience. This new spiritualism was not confined to Welsburg. Across Germany, SS marriages and family ceremonies followed a similar pattern. Civil life was rewritten in the language of race and destiny. Couples were required to prove their ancestry before they could wed, their union framed as a contribution to the future of the Volk. Births were celebrated not simply as private joy, but as national triumph. Even death was transformed with funerals conducted under banners and vows renewed. Beside graves, the private moments of life became public acts of ideology. The SS had reached into the most intimate corners of existence and claimed them its own. For its members, this control felt like belonging. The rituals gave them certainty in a world that demanded faith over doubt, and in that certainty, morality was replaced by myth. For the young recruit, the transformation was gradual. At first, he learned to march, to salute, to obey. Then he learned to think differently, to see loyalty as truth and obedience as virtue. He was told that the blood in his veins connected him to heroes, that he was chosen by nature to protect the purity of mankind. Each ceremony reinforced this idea until it became instinct. The more he gave himself to the order, the more he lost the ability to see the world outside it. The uniform
no longer symbolized duty. It became identity in the mirror. He did not see a man. He saw an ideal reflected back at him. By the time he stood beneath banners and repeated the sacred vows, he no longer questioned what he served. His faith had been shaped into an instrument, and that instrument would soon be used without hesitation. The rituals, for all their grandeur, hid a deeper purpose. They were not celebrations of unity, but tools of conditioning. Each oath tightened hold of the leadership over its followers, erasing the distance between individual will and institutional command. The ceremonies were designed to replace thought with rhythm, conscience with creed. The power of these acts lay in repetition. 1,000 small gestures, salutes, songs, affirmations, wove themselves into daily life until obedience became effortless. To disobey was not just treason, it was heresy. In this atmosphere, doubt was unthinkable, and pity felt like weakness. The SS had achieved what every tyrant desires, a system that could perpetuate itself through belief alone. Yet beneath the rituals there was fear. Fear of failure, fear of impurity, fear of being less than perfect in the eyes of the order. The men who looked invincible in their uniforms were haunted by the need to prove their worth. Inspections were constant, reports frequent, and suspicion ever present. Those who faltered, even slightly, could be dismissed, shamed, or erased from the ranks altogether. The ideology that claimed to create strength was feeding on insecurity. The more the order demanded perfection, the more fragile its members became. Their loyalty was not born confidence, but of terror. Terror of being cast out from the faith they had built their lives around. What had begun as devotion had hardened into dependency. By 1939, as the storm of war gathered beyond Germany's borders, the SS stood as both symbol and engine of the regime's power. Its members had been transformed from men into instruments, from believers into enforcers. The rituals that once bound them together in reverence would soon bind them to acts far darker. Their faith, cultivated through ceremony and myth, would become the foundation for violence justified as virtue. The order had found its purpose, and its purpose would consume the world. The torches that once lit their oaths would soon light the path to war. In the name of purity, they bound themselves to darkness. When the war began, in September of 1939, the ideals the SS had cultivated for years finally met the test of reality. The invasion of Poland was swift, planned with mechanical precision, and executed with merciless efficiency. Behind the front lines came men in black and grey uniforms, the Einsatzgruppen, tasked not with battle, but with order. Their mission, described in language of security and cleansing, carried within it the full weight of the SS ideology. They followed the army like a shadow, recording, classifying, and removing whatever was deemed undesirable. In the fields where villages had stood, smoke lingered like memory, refusing to fade. Roads filled with refugees moved in silence, their faces blank with exhaustion. The soldiers walked through them without speaking, unable or unwilling to see what was unfolding. For the officers, the campaign was both victory and revelation. The theories they had once studied about race, purity, and destiny now found their expression in violence, carried out as duty. The border between belief and brutality had disappeared. In letters sent home, a few SS men tried to describe what they saw. They spoke of discipline, of obedience, of the burden of command. They did not speak of guilt, though it lived between the lines. The language of official reports avoided emotion altogether. Everything was
phrased in terms of operations completed, objectives achieved, tasks fulfilled. Words like security, pacification, and processing replaced anything human. Bureaucracy had entered the field of war. Orders from Himmler and Heydrich defined who was to be removed, and where the lists ended, interpretation began. Men who had sworn to uphold purity now found themselves measuring it in blood. For some it became routine, for others it became unbearable. But all learned the same lesson. Once the system begins to kill, it demands participants, not believers. In the towns and forests of occupied Poland, ideology unfolded as method. Jews, intellectuals, political leaders, anyone capable of shaping resistance, were marked first. Entire communities vanished without public notice. Villages burned quietly, their ashes blending with the frost that settled each morning. Civilians were ordered to stand aside and watch, though most could hardly raise their eyes. The SS officers kept records of each action, often pausing to document what they called results. The efficiency was chilling, even to those who commanded it. The violence was not wild, but organized, and that made it harder to name. What had begun as conquest was becoming something darker, an experiment in how far obedience could reach. Each act reinforced the belief that control justified cruelty, and beneath the grey winter sky, belief and fear became indistinguishable. When the invasion of the Soviet Union began in 1941, the scale of destruction expanded beyond imagination. The East was not simply territory to be taken, it was a vision to be fulfilled. In Nazi ideology, it was the space of destiny, the land that would be cleared, colonized, and remade for the superior race. The SS understood its role not as soldiers, but as instruments of transformation. The Einheitsgruppen moved behind the army once more, following a pattern already learned in Poland. Towns were mapped, populations listed, and orders carried out with silent precision. Fields that had once grown wheat were now littered with things no one wished to name. Reports sent back to Berlin described the numbers with a cold clarity that disguised their meaning. In their own minds, the officers were not committing crimes, they were fulfilling a plan. When ideology shapes reality, morality becomes the first casualty. For the men who carried out these orders, the transformation from human to instrument was almost complete. In their letters, they still wrote of home, of weather, of food. They spoke of loyalty and duty, of serving something larger than themselves. They did not write of faces or voices or screams. Those details belonged to a world they could no longer admit existed. A photograph of a family might slip from a uniform pocket as an officer walked through a ruined village. It would fall quietly into the mud, and mist, and, unclaimed, a small fragment of the self left behind. In the machinery of conquest, personal memory became irrelevant. The SS had built an empire of obedience, and in that empire, compassion was an act of defiance. The war in the East was not only fought on maps and battlefields, it was fought within the minds of men trained to forget their own humanity. As the months passed, the brutality became routine. Orders arrived, actions followed, reports were filed, each atrocity made the next one easier, and silence became the lubricant of efficiency. The soldiers stopped asking questions, not out of belief, but because questions had no answer that could make sense of what they had done. The higher command praised discipline and discouraged reflection. Himmler himself visited the front, urging his men to endure the moral burden as part of their sacred duty. He told them they were sacrificing their souls for the salvation of the race. Some believed him, others simply nodded, grateful for any words that could make sense of the emptiness inside. The East devoured not only its victims but its conquerors. The ideology that demanded purity left only contamination behind. The consequences of this campaign extended beyond the front. In Berlin, reports were compiled, summarized, and distributed among departments. The numbers were studied as if they represented production figures, not lives. Policies evolved from these statistics, shaping what would later become the architecture of genocide. The SS learned to think in terms of scale, to plan not for battles, but for outcomes measured in populations. The killing fields of the East became both laboratory and precedent. When the gas chambers and deportations came, they were justified as efficiency improvements, extensions of what had already begun. The East was no longer a place, but a process. It consumed everything it touched, faith, reason, and morality itself. By 1941, the myth of purity that had once seemed abstract had hardened into history's darkest fact. The SS had become the hand through which ideology achieved its most terrible form. Behind the silence of the forests, beneath the snow and the ashes, lay the evidence of a vision that mistook destruction for creation. The men who marched eastward believed they were conquering, but they were only descending into something ancient and wordless, where conviction outlived conscience. The reports kept arriving, the trains kept moving, and the frost kept falling. The war had changed everything, yet in the minds of its architects, nothing had changed at all. They were still building their perfect world, even as it consumed them. The East was not conquered, it was consumed. By the winter of 1941, the war had entered a new and terrible phase. What had begun as conquest was transforming into extermination. The ideology that once spoke of renewal now found its ultimate expression in annihilation. Across occupied Europe, camps multiplied, some for labor, others for death. The SS had become architect of a system so vast and intricate that it required railways, industries, and officers to sustain it. The murder of millions was no longer a series of isolated atrocities. It had become an enterprise. Train schedules were aligned with quotas, and bureaucrats drew lines on maps to mark where lives would end. Commandants received orders written in the language of logistics, not morality. The work was described as special treatment, a phrase that disguised horror in civility. Beneath the winter sky, chimneys began to smoke, and that smoke would never entirely clear. Auschwitz became the emblem of this transformation, a place where efficiency replaced even the pretense of reason. Originally built as a detention camp, it expanded into something unimaginable. New buildings rose in rows of concrete and wire, designed for the processing of human beings. Engineers and contractors submitted plans as if designing any other factory. They calculated ventilation, capacity, and throughput. The killing process was broken down into steps: arrival, registration, undressing, death, disposal. Each part was overseen by specialists who believed they were improving operations. The language of industrial progress cloaked the reality of moral collapse. Men in uniforms recorded figures with pride, their reports filled with statistics, not names. Every morning the same smoke rose, and every evening the same silence settled. The world had never seen such order applied to such chaos. The men who commanded these camps often described themselves as administrators,
not murderers. Rudolf Erzatowitz kept detailed records, believing precision could shield him from guilt. He wrote of efficiency, of discipline, of maintaining morale among his staff. His superiors congratulated him for his results. The SS leadership spoke of the solution as though it were a matter of policy, not people. Meetings in Berlin formalized the process, assigning departments, transport routes, and supplies. The 1C Conference of 1942 distilled genocide into a list of figures and categories. The participants left the table believing they had solved a problem, not created one. This was the final triumph of bureaucracy, the transformation of crime into paperwork. Once defined and recorded, the unthinkable became routine. The machinery of death required no hatred, only organization. Inside the camps, time lost its meaning. The prisoners who entered often did not leave. Those who remained lived in a world measured in moments, not days. Hunger, disease, and labor consumed bodies faster than replacements could arrive. Guards walked the perimeter with practiced detachment. They followed rules, filled forms, and submitted reports. Cruelty became procedure. The line between duty and destruction disappeared entirely. The chimneys burned day and night, their smoke a reminder of what lay just beyond the fence. The air itself seemed to carry the memory of suffering. The silence between train arrivals was heavy, as if the world itself had paused to listen. And when the next whistle came, the silence broke like glass. The artifacts of the dead remained long after their names were erased. Piles of shoes, hair, glasses, and toys filled warehouses, labeled for storage. Each object was evidence of a life interrupted. Yet in the camps, accounting, they were simply materials. Prisoners were forced to sort through them, handling the remnants of strangers. The camps became places where nothing was wasted, not labor, not life, not even death. Factories nearby used the belongings and sometimes the remains for profit. The SS justified it as efficiency. They called it recovery, a word that hid the truth it described. Every object saved was a story silenced. The cruelty was not in the killing alone, but in the system's ability to erase its victims while keeping their possessions in perfect order. For the survivors, memory became both punishment and resistance. They lived in the shadow of numbers, tattooed on their arms, reminders that identity had been turned into inventory. Each breath carried the weight of what they had seen. Their testimonies would later give voice to the millions who could not speak, yet even their words could not fully describe what the camps had done, not only to their bodies, but to the idea of humanity itself. The SS had built a machine that consumed both victim and perpetrator, leaving emptiness in its wake. Those who survived carried with them the silence that the dead could no longer hold. That silence would outlast the war. It would live in the air, in the ashes, in the quiet unease that follows every mention of those places. For the SS commandants and clerks, the end came slowly as the war turned against Germany. The camps grew frantic, their records hurried, their efficiency breaking down. Orders shifted from expansion to concealment. Files were burned, structures destroyed, witnesses executed. Yet the traces remained: ledgers, photographs, personal letters, fragments of testimony. The same precision that had built the system ensured its survival in history. When the Allies arrived, they found not only victims, but archives. The evidence spoke in the same calm, bureaucratic voice that had once justified everything. In those documents, horror had found its accountant. In the years that followed, the world struggled to comprehend what had been revealed. The trial transcripts and survivor accounts painted a picture that seemed beyond belief. Yet, it was all meticulously recorded. The SS had succeeded in making murder appear administrative, and that was its greatest crime. It proved how ordinary structures could be turned toward extraordinary evil. The camps were dismantled, but their logic, the belief that efficiency can justify anything, remained as warning. The smoke that once curled into the winter air had faded, but its shadow lingered. Even silence had weight, and the sky carried it. Still, by 1942, the SS had become more than a military or political organization. It had become an empire in its own right. Its black insignia appeared not only on the battlefield, but in factories, hospitals, research institutes, and ministries. Every branch of German life seemed to have a thread that led back to Himmler's vast web of authority. The SS was no longer confined to the task of killing. It now governed the machina. Why that sustained the war. Its reach extended from the front lines of the Waffen-SS divisions to the administrative offices that managed occupied territories. In this labyrinth of order, men no longer saw themselves as individuals, but as instruments of efficiency. Files replaced faces, reports replaced reality, and reality dissolved into mathematics. The ideology that once burned with fanatical passion had cooled into the logic of control. The empire of obedience had found its most enduring form, not in the violence of the field, but in the calm of the office. Himmler ruled this empire like a scholar of hierarchy, surrounding himself with documents, maps, and ledgers. His ambition was not only to conquer land, but to reorder it according to his vision of purity and discipline. He saw in the occupied East a laboratory for the future, a place where German rule would reshape entire societies. To realize this, he needed not only soldiers, but planners, engineers, and doctors. The SS became the overseer of vast networks of forced labor, drawing millions of men and women from across Europe into camps and factories. Companies partnered with the SS to secure workers for their assembly lines, their profits rising in proportion to human suffering. Prisoners dug trenches, built roads, and worked machinery until they collapsed. Each death was replaced by another number, another entry in a report that reached Himmler's desk. The scale of it all created the illusion of control. It was an empire sustained by calculation, not conscience. Within this order, the Waffen-SS expanded into an army of its own, rivaling the traditional military. Its divisions fought from the Arctic Circle to North Africa, spreading the emblem of the Black Sun across the continent. To many young recruits, the Waffen-SS represented honor and strength, a chance to serve the Reich as part of an elite brotherhood. They were taught that their duty transcended politics, that they were the chosen defenders of Europe's destiny. Behind that illusion lay exploitation on a colossal scale. The laborers who built their roads and supplied their materials worked under conditions of starvation and terror. The soldiers fought with fanatic discipline, believing themselves pure while standing on ground soaked in the lives of the enslaved. The same order that glorified courage depended on the systematic degradation of others. Even in its most triumphant moments, the SS empire revealed its paradox. It could not exist without the suffering it pretended to cleanse. The SS extended its reach into medicine, transforming science into another instrument of ideology. Under its supervision, doctors conducted experiments that blurred the boundary between research and atrocity. They measured endurance through pain, studied disease by creating it, and justified everything as service to knowledge. The pursuit of purity infected every field, turning ethics into efficiency. Reports from camp laboratories described results in sterile language, never naming the victims. The SS called it progress. In universities and clinics, many looked away, preferring not to know how the data had been gathered.
Within this web of complicity, the doctor and the bureaucrat became indistinguishable. Both recorded outcomes. Neither acknowledged meaning. Science, stripped of humanity, became the twin of administration. Together, they built a world where morality could no longer interfere with results. In offices across Berlin, administrators managed this empire as if it were a business. They drafted budgets, balanced accounts, and reviewed production figures. The files that passed across their desks spoke of quotas, not people. A camp that produced too few goods was labeled inefficient. One that consumed too many prisoners too quickly was marked for improvement. The logic was chillingly consistent. Human life had become a variable, its value determined by output. The administrators prided themselves on accuracy, not mercy. They believed that perfection in their work redeemed the imperfections of the world. As they signed their papers, they thought of themselves not as villains, but as professionals. Their detachment was their refuge. It allowed them to live with the unbearable by refusing to recognize it. The sound of their pens replaced the sound of conscience. Yet beneath the calm surface of reports and figures, cracks began to form. By 1943, the war had turned against Germany. Supply lines stretched thin, the front receded, and the empire built on efficiency began to strain under its own weight. Labor shortages forced even harsher exploitation, and production faltered as factories filled with the dead and the dying. The SS's vast administrative machine consumed more energy maintaining itself than serving the war effort. Himmler issued orders for greater discipline, greater faith, greater sacrifice. His subordinates nodded, even as they knew the system was collapsing. In the offices, where once there had been order, now there was confusion. The ledgers no longer matched reality. The empire that prided itself on precision was rotting from within, undone by the very rigidity that had once made it strong. For the administrator, who once tracked numbers with pride, the change came quietly. Reports that had once arrived daily came late or not at all. Figures no longer told a coherent story. He continued to work, to stamp, to file, to pretend that his signature still meant something. Outside his window, the sound of air raid sirens replaced the hum of industry. He looked at the maps on his wall, now marked with red lines creeping closer to the Reich's heart. Yet still he believed, or told himself he did. His task was to maintain order, even as the world dissolved into chaos. Each day he arrived at his desk, a loyal functionary in a crumbling empire. He did not question the purpose of his work, only the precision of its execution. His loyalty had become a habit, his morality a forgotten language. By 1944, the SS stood at the height of its size and the edge of its ruin. Its divisions were scattered across collapsing fronts, its factories choked by shortages, its camps overflowing with death and despair. Yet even then, its administrators continued to write, record, and report, preserving the illusion that control still existed. The empire that had once claimed to bring order to the world had only spread ruin. It was a monument to obedience, built on the bones of its victims, and sustained by the silence of its servants. When the end came, it would not collapse suddenly, but slowly. Like a structure hollowed out from within, its architects would insist they had merely followed instructions, that they had served faithfully, that they had done their duty. And in a sense they built an empire of order upon the bones of chaos. By 1944, the promise of victory had turned to the taste of ash. The great campaigns that were meant to secure the 1,000-year empire had ended instead in attrition and retreat. The Eastern Front, once the symbol of boundless ambition, had become a graveyard of machines and men. The snow that fell over the fields of Ukraine and Belarus did not melt with spring. It buried entire armies and swallowed entire cities. The Waffen-SS, once celebrated as the elite of the Reich, now fought battles of survival rather than conquest. Their ranks, once filled with eager believers, were replenished with conscripts drawn from across occupied Europe. The purity they once preached had been replaced by pragmatism. Discipline remained, but faith was eroding. Orders were still obeyed, but without conviction, and beneath the ice, The first cracks of despair began to spread through the iron facade of loyalty. Stalingrad had already marked the beginning of that fracture. The defeat there in the winter of 1943 had shattered the illusion of invincibility that had held the Reich together. For the SS, who had been taught that belief could overcome any obstacle, the truth was unbearable. The myth of destiny could not survive the arithmetic of loss. Entire divisions vanished into the white vastness of the East, their names later recited like prayers for the dead. Himmler called for renewed faith, insisting that struggle itself was purification, that hardship proved righteousness. But faith cannot feed the starving or warm the frozen. On the front lines, men clung not to ideology, but to survival. Letters home became shorter, the tone more resigned. Hope was replaced by habit and obedience by exhaustion. The war had devoured its own believers, leaving only its functionaries behind. In the occupied territories, the SS continued to administer its empire, but the machinery of control began to falter. Allied bombings destroyed supply lines, railways, and communications. The grand bureaucracy that had once functioned with mechanical precision was now besieged by chaos. Reports arrived incomplete, or not at all. Orders were issued that could no longer be enforced. The confidence of the early years had vanished, replaced by the brittle insistence of routine. Even the most devoted officers began to sense that the structure they served was hollow. Himmler issued new directives demanding total commitment, total faith, total sacrifice. His words, once spoken with authority, now carried the thin edge of desperation. He spoke of loyalty, while the ground beneath him gave way. The empire of order was being overtaken by disorder. On the front lines, the Waffen-SS fought with the ferocity of men who knew there was nowhere left to retreat. They burned their letters before battle, unwilling to leave behind their doubts or their fears. Tanks lay half buried in snowdrifts, their engines frozen, and their crews silent. Soldiers scavenged for food among the ruins of villages that had already been destroyed twice. The sense of purpose that had once carried them forward was gone, replaced by an instinct that had no name. Commanders still spoke of honor and victory, but their voices were, their eyes hollow. In the distance, the sky glowed with the fires of cities, burning behind them. Each man fought, alone now, bound not by belief, but by the inertia of survival. The order that once promised meaning had become a chain bound their necks. Inside Germany, the illusion of control continued to flicker. Even as the lights dimmed, propaganda still spoke of triumph. But the silence of the people told a different story. Cities lay in ruins, factories stood empty, and trains that once carried victims now carried refugees. The SS tried to maintain its grip, policing loyalty even as loyalty itself evaporated. Fear remained their last instrument of power. Executions for defeatism increased, and suspicion became the last functioning bureaucracy. The order that had once thrived on certainty now survived on denial. Himmler watched his empire shrink from behind his desk, staring at maps that no longer matched reality. Every red line he drew was already outdated by the time his pen lifted. Yet he still spoke of destiny, even as destiny slipped through his fingers like dust. The Waffen-SS divisions scattered across collapsing fronts became symbols of contradiction. They fought with the determination of men defending an idea that no longer existed. In France, they faced the Allied invasion in the East. They faced an enemy that seemed endless. Each retreat was renamed a tactical withdrawal. Each defeat a temporary setback, but the truth was visible in their faces. The eyes that once gleamed with conviction now held only weariness. The black uniforms, once symbols of order, were covered in the same mud as the rest. The mythology of the SS had always been built on control. But now even control itself was slipping away. The soldiers no longer spoke of purity or honor. They spoke of home, of warmth, of anything that could outlast the cold. By late 1944, the Reich's collapse had become undeniable. Cities were lost faster than they could be renamed. The factories that once produced weapons now produced only rubble. The SS stretched thin across Europe, became a patchwork of chaos, masquerading as command. In the camps, killings continued even as defeat loomed, a grim attempt to maintain control in the face of ruin. The administrators burned documents, the soldiers burned bridges, and in the midst of it all, Himmler still spoke of a future that no one believed in. The order that had once defined itself by loyalty was now held together only by fear. The empire of certainty had become an empire of ghosts. When 1944 drew to its end, the silence in Germany was heavier than the sound of bombs. The belief that had once ignited an entire nation had gutted into ashes. The SS, born of discipline and myth, now stood as a monument to futility. Its leaders clung to rituals that no longer had meaning. Its soldiers obeyed commands that no longer had purpose. What had begun as conviction had ended in collapse. The oaths that had once bound them now strangled them. The order that had promised eternity began to choke on its own silence. By the first months of 1945, the empire that had once called itself eternal was dissolving in smoke and silence. The grand architecture of the Reich lay in ruins, its monument shattered, its promises undone. The SS, once the disciplined embodiment of order, was scattered across a continent, now closing in on itself. In Berlin, the sound of artillery grew closer each day, echoing through the empty halls of ministries and command centers. Men who had once spoken in the language of certainty now whispered, unsure which orders still mattered. The black uniforms that had inspired fear now drew only suspicion. Files were burned, badges discarded, and names erased in haste. The empire that had prided itself on record-keeping now sought to destroy its own memory. Ashes rose where documents once lay in neat stacks. The silence of secrecy had become the silence of defeat. Inside the Reich Chancellery, flames consumed the evidence of a dying regime. Clerks who had once typed with precision now fed papers into fires that devoured their lives' work. The air was thick with the smell of burning ink and scorched leather. Pages that had recorded the crimes of millions were reduced to dust within hours. What had taken years to build was being undone in a single night. Outside, soldiers dragged furniture into the streets to build barricades that would not last the day. In basements, officers drank in silence, their medals scattered on tables beside them. The war that was supposed to define 1,000 years had collapsed into a few desperate hours. Some still spoke of orders from Hitler, though no one could say if he was still alive. The sound of gunfire came closer, and the fire in the chancellery spread, erasing not only the past, but the illusion of control. Across Germany, the SS was unraveling from within. Divisions that had once marched in unity now fled in fragments. Commanders abandoned their posts, taking with them forged papers, stolen vehicles, and false names. For the first time, obedience failed. Some men surrendered to Allied forces, others to the advancing Soviets, and some disappeared into forests, hoping anonymity would protect them. The elaborate hierarchy that had once structured every breath of the SS now meant nothing. Without the symbols of rank, they were simply men, tired, hungry,
and afraid. In their retreat, they burned villages to cover their passage, not out of ideology, but desperation. The myth of purity had devolved into chaos. The uniform that once represented faith in order had become a mark of guilt. Every black coat became a target, every insignia a sentence. For those still loyal to the idea of the SS, the disintegration was unthinkable. They clung to rituals long emptied of meaning. Oaths were repeated to no one. Orders were issued to units that no longer existed. Even as the walls closed around them, some officers spoke of regrouping, of rebuilding, of destiny, deferred but not destroyed. But in their eyes the certainty was gone. The sacred brotherhood had become a rumor whispered among ruins. In the east, the Waffen SS fought on, driven not by faith, but by the fear of capture. In the west, others tried to bargain their surrender, claiming they had only followed orders. The same words that had once justified obedience now served as defense. Yet in both cases, the truth was the same. The order that claimed to shape the world could not even save itself. Its devotion had turned inward and devoured its believers. As Allied forces advanced, the world the SS had built collapsed. Piece by piece, camps were discovered, their gates thrown open to reveal what the Empire had tried to hide. Civilians stood in silence as the scale of the crimes became visible. The paperwork that survived told a story more precise than confession could ever be. Ledgers listed names, trains, and totals, each line an act of erasure. The soldiers who entered these places were met not by defenders, but by ghosts. For the SS men who survived, there was no redemption left in loyalty. Some took their own lives, believing death preferable to capture. Others simply walked away, leaving their uniforms in ditches, their insignia buried in the mud. The belief that had once guided their every action had turned to dust between their fingers. Among those who fled were men who had once believed themselves untouchable. They crossed borders under false identities, taking refuge in obscurity. Some found shelter among sympathetic communities. Others were caught within weeks. A few reached distant continents, where they would live for decades under borrowed names. Yet even in exile, the weight of the past followed them. The silence they carried was not peace, but punishment. The myth of the SS had been that of endurance, of eternal vigilance. But now, it survived only in denial. The men who had once sworn allegiance to a vision larger than life were haunted by its smallness in death. They had destroyed everything to preserve an illusion, and, in the end, the illusion consumed them. In Berlin, the last loyal SS units guarded bunkers filled with smoke and despair. Hitler was gone, the city was falling, and the once proud symbols of the Reich were being buried beneath rubble. Himmler, stripped of authority, wandered between command posts, still speaking of negotiations that no one would accept. His power, once absolute, now meant nothing. The empire he had built on loyalty had left him utterly alone. As the Red Army closed in, fires spread through what remained of the capital. Each burning building seemed to mirror the collapse of belief itself. The SS, once the architects of fear, had become its final victims. Their discipline dissolved into confusion, their rituals into madness, their obedience into escape. When the guns finally fell silent, nothing remained of the faith that had once promised renewal. The ruins of Berlin stood as monuments to delusion and despair. The SS had begun as a creed of order, and ended as a symbol of collapse. Its leaders were dead, its soldiers scattered, its ideology discredited forever.
The black uniforms that once gleamed under torchlight now lay buried beneath mud and ash. The files, the ceremonies, the oaths, all had burned away. What endured was only memory, and even that carried the weight of shame. The men who had once believed themselves immortal had vanished into history's grey twilight. They had built a myth of purity and drowned in its ashes. In the spring of 1945, the world exhaled, but the air was heavy with ghosts. The guns had fallen silent, yet the work of reckoning had only just begun. Across Europe, Allied soldiers stumbled upon camps that still reek of ash and absence. What they found there defied both language and comprehension. The SS had vanished into the forests, the villages, the anonymity of surrender, leaving behind only ledgers, corpses, and questions. For investigators, the war was over, but the pursuit was not. Justice became the new campaign, fought not with rifles, but with evidence. Names were gathered, faces catalogued, and lists compiled. The machinery of the Reich had fallen silent, but the machinery of accountability was awakening. It would take years to sift through the wreckage, to trace the lines between the men who had built the empire of terror and those who had merely lived within it. In the ruins, the victors began to ask who was guilty and who was simply part of the machine. The Nuremberg trials began that November. In a city still scarred by war, the courtroom, cold and sterile, became the stage for a moral reckoning unprecedented in human history. Behind glass sat the architects of empire, men who had once commanded armies, ministries, and the SS itself. Now they listened as their own documents condemned them. Pages that had once dictated the machinery of death were read aloud under the light of justice. Some sat motionless, others took notes, as if preparing for another meeting. The prosecutor spoke calmly, presenting facts instead of fury. For the first time, the world saw evil not as chaos, but as administration. The defense spoke of duty, of obedience, of ignorance. The same words that had kept the system running, but no argument could erase what had been recorded. The SS was declared a criminal organization, its name forever synonymous with mechanized atrocity. The verdicts were read and history drew its breath, waiting for the echo. Outside the courtroom, the pursuit spread across continents. Thousands of SS members had escaped the immediate chaos of surrender. Some were captured in uniform. Others had already traded theirs for civilian coats and false names. The routes of escape through Austria, Italy, and Spain became known as the rat lines. Priests, diplomats, and former sympathizers helped them cross borders, often in exchange for gold or silence. They moved at night, carrying forged papers and fragments of the past. A few reached distant ports and boarded ships bound for South America. Others disappeared into the anonymity of rural Germany, blending in with refugees who had lost everything. Each fugitive represented an unanswered question, a gap in the story of justice. The war had scattered its perpetrators as widely as its victims. Finding them would require patience measured not in months, but in decades. For investigators, the task was relentless. Allied intelligence officers, many of them young and burdened by what they had seen in the camps, worked through thousands of files by lamplight. Each name traced on a page might lead to a village, a border crossing, or a grave. The work was methodical, impersonal, and haunted. In some offices, survivors assisted the search, bringing with them memories sharper than any photograph. They described faces, accents, gestures, fragments of recognition that might connect one identity to another. The interrogations that followed were quiet, often conducted in cold rooms under flickering lights. The questions were not shouted, but spoken slowly. Each word weighed. For every captured officer, dozens slipped away. Yet the investigators persisted, driven by a kind of moral inertia, a belief that even fragments of truth
could restore something of the world's balance. Meanwhile, those who fled struggled under the weight of the lives they had stolen. In small towns and distant colonies, they built new existences with names that were not their own. Some worked as farmers, others as doctors or mechanics. They raised families who never knew who they had been. In letters, they avoided the past, writing of weather, crops, and health. But the past never truly let them go. A knock on the door could arrive years later, or never at all. The men who had once stood proudly beneath banners now lived in fear of their own reflections. Their flight did not bring freedom, only delay. For them, the war never ended. It merely changed its form. Every forged passport, every border crossed was another act of self-erasure. They had escaped the collapse of their empire, but not the shadow of what it had done. For survivors, the pursuit of justice was not vengeance, but memory made solid. They testified in courts, spoke to journalists, and provided names from photographs that others could no longer bear to see. Their words carried the authority of laws. In each recounting they rebuilt what the SS had tried to erase: individuality, humanity, presence. But testimony came at a cost. Each recollection reopened wounds that never truly closed. Some found solace in speaking, others never spoke at all. Their stories, scattered like ashes across decades, became the foundation of remembrance. The world for the first time began to define the unthinkable, not by numbers, but by faces. And through that recognition, justice became something deeper than punishment. It became acknowledgement. The pursuit continued into the late 1940s, evolving into an international effort. Files were exchanged, archives reopened, and new networks of investigators emerged. Yet, as time passed, the clarity of victory faded. The Cold War had begun, and political priorities shifted. Former SS men found themselves useful to new masters, valued for their knowledge of intelligence or warfare. Justice, once a crusade, became entangled in diplomacy. Some trials were postponed, others quietly forgotten. Still, a few investigators refused to stop searching. They worked not for governments, but for conscience. In their persistence, the idea of moral continuity survived, the belief that no crime should vanish into history unexamined. By 1947, Europe was rebuilding, its streets filled with new life. But beneath that renewal lingered a quiet unease. The SS was gone, its symbols banned, its leaders executed or imprisoned. Yet the structures it had built, the systems of order, the obedience to hierarchy, the worship of efficiency had left their imprint. Justice had drawn its lines, but the shadows remained, shifting just beyond reach. The uniforms were gone, the banners burned, the oaths forgotten. But the habits of silence and the mechanisms of denial still moved among the living. History had not yet finished with its reckoning. The hunt would continue for years, sometimes in courts, sometimes in memory. The war had ended, but its echo still followed every step. The uniforms were gone, but the shadows had learned to travel light. In the years that followed the war, Europe became a continent of silence. The ruins were being rebuilt, but beneath the sound of hammers and cranes lay an unspoken grief. Cities rose again from ashes, their new walls hiding the scars of the old. People learned to speak of the future, not the past. The war was too vast to comprehend, its horrors too near to name. In the classrooms of Germany, history paused mid-sentence. The SS, once omnipresent, now vanished from conversation, as if silence could cleanse memory. The survivors returned to lives that no longer existed. Their stories carried like invisible weights. The victors moved on, eager to restore normally, but the shadows of the past did not fade. They simply learned to move quietly through the reconstruction. The silence that followed the war was not peace. It was the stillness before remembrance. In courtrooms across Europe, justice continued in fragments. Lesser trials followed Nuremberg, held in small towns and provincial halls. The accused stood before judges who had once saluted them. Evidence was presented, documents, photographs, and testimonies that the world still struggled to believe. Some trials ended with convictions, others with acquit. Many records were sealed,
hidden from view for decades. The machinery of law proved ill-suited to the magnitude of moral catastrophe. Witnesses spoke into microphones that distorted their voices. Their memories replayed through poor translation and disbelief. The enormity of the crimes often overwhelmed the capacity for understanding. People preferred the simplicity of rebuilding to the complexity of reckoning. Justice, while sought, came quietly and incompletely. It would take generations for the full truth to find its place in history. For survivors, those years were a test of endurance unlike any they had known before. Having survived the camps, they now faced the indifference of a world that wished to forget. They carried memories that others doubted, stories that seemed too monstrous to be real. Many fell silent, unable to relive what they had endured in words. Others spoke tirelessly, hoping that testimony might anchor truth against denial. Their voices, often trembling, became the fragile bridge between experience and history. In schools, their names were rarely mentioned. In newspapers, their accounts were brief. Yet each story that was told planted a seed. From those fragments of remembrance, a collective understanding would one day grow. But for now, memory lived in the margins, waiting for the world to be ready to listen. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers began the slow work of assembling what had been scattered. They combed through archives, piecing together fragments of records that had escaped the flames. In dimly lit rooms they watched reels of testimony, each frame a confrontation with the unspeakable. The SS, which had once been a symbol of order, now appeared as an emblem of humanity's collapse. Yet even then resistance to remembering persisted. Many argued that it was time to move on, that dwelling on the past only deepened division. In the East, new regimes recast history for ideology. In the West, silence was often mistaken for dignity. The truth was inconvenient, and those who sought it often worked alone. Still, their persistence began to give shape to what the world had tried to ignore. The historian's pen became the quiet instrument of justice when courts had failed to deliver it. Germany itself was caught between guilt and denial. The older generation guarded its silence. The younger one grew restless with unanswered questions. Teachers avoided discussions of the camps, focusing instead on rebuilding and recovery. Streets once named for generals were renamed for poets, as if language itself could cleanse memory. Yet beneath the surface, shame lingered like a second shadow. For some, silence was protection. For others, it was confession. Churches spoke of forgiveness, but the words felt hollow without acknowledgement. The moral vocabulary of an entire nation had to be rebuilt from the ground up. In those years, remembering was dangerous, and forgetting was easier. It would take time before silence began to crack, and when it did, the sound was more like mourning than revelation. In the rest of the world, the image of the SS transformed from fact to symbol. Books and films began to portray its members as the embodiment of evil, precise, disciplined, faceless. Yet in doing so, they sometimes stripped the story of its complexity. The horror became mythic, distant, almost unreal. Few wanted to admit that such men had once been neighbors, clerks, and fathers. The simplicity of condemnation often replaced the harder work of comprehension. But art and memory, even when imperfect, kept the story alive. The names of places Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald became sacred in their own grim way. They marked the geography of loss, ensuring that forgetting would never be complete. The world was beginning to remember, even as it still pretended not to. For the children of the post-war years, memory was an inheritance wrapped in silence. They grew up among ruins turned to parks beside rivers that had carried both commerce and death in the attics of rebuilt homes. They found photographs their parents could not explain. The truth arrived not as revelation but as unease. They began to ask questions that had no easy answers. The silence of their elders became its own kind of confession. In time they would become the generation that demanded history to speak plainly. Their insistence would open archives, provoke debates, and bring new light to long-buried truths. Through them, the long silence began to tremble, not from noise,
but from memory returning to voice. By the mid-1950s, the world had learned to live beside its ghosts. Monuments began to rise, not in triumph, but in warning. Testimonies were recorded on grainy film, their voices trembling but clear. The crimes of the SS, once buried in denial, had begun to find their place in history. Yet for every truth uncovered, another remained hidden in the hearts of those who lived it. Memory had survived the silence, but it had changed. It spoke softly now, cautious of being forgotten again. The world moved forward, but the weight of remembrance never left its shoulders. The story of the SS had ended, but its echo lingered in classrooms, in archives. In the uneasy quiet between generations, truth took years to speak, and even then it whispered. In the decade after the war, the world entered an uneasy calm. Cities were rebuilt, alliances redrawn, and the new conflict of the Cold War began to shadow the old. But beneath the surface, something else endured. The quiet movement of men who refused to let the past die. Across Europe and South America, a network began to take form, stitched together from old loyalties and new opportunities. Former SS officers hiding under false names found refuge in monasteries, shipping companies, and sympathetic embassies. They called their channels the rat lines. Escape routes carved through the ruins of post-war chaos. The war had ended, but its architects had not all been captured. They moved like smoke through the cracks of a divided world, carried by silence and complicity. In a time when nations were choosing sides between East and West, old crimes were quietly set aside in favor of new priorities. The pursuit of justice had become a race against amnesia. The organization that would later be known as Odessa, the organization of former SS members, became the ghost of the Reich. Though its existence was often debated, its traces were real enough to follow. Clergy sympathetic to anti-communist refugees provided papers and money. Diplomats turned their gaze away. Ships left European ports carrying passengers who vanished upon arrival. In Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Santiago, new lives began with forged passports and borrowed histories. Men who had once worn black uniforms now wore linen suits. Their accents softened with time. They founded businesses, advised governments, and told their children that they had been soldiers. Nothing more. Some even prospered, building comfortable lives on distant shores. The myth of the SS, purified of its crimes, found fertile ground in exile. The network thrived on denial, and denial thrived on distance. What could not be erased was merely displaced. For those who sought justice, the trail was faint and scattered. Investigators, journalists, and survivors followed rumors across borders and decades. A letter intercepted in Rome, a photograph taken in Chile, a bank record from Zurich. Each clue was a thread in a web spun by absence. Men like Simon Wiesenthal dedicated their lives to this pursuit, turning obsession into duty. He worked in small offices filled with files and fading photographs, piecing together what governments preferred to forget. To him, justice was not vengeance, but memory made tangible. The world moved on. He did not. In every quiet face he met, he saw the possibility of recognition. The flicker of guilt disguised as calm. His persistence forced history to stay awake. For every fugitive that escaped, another was found, dragged from the comfort of anonymity into the harsh light of accountability. The war was over, but the reckoning remained unfinished. South America became the landscape of exile. Argentina under one prawn offered sanctuary to thousands of former Nazis, presenting their rival as an act of humanitarian mercy. They brought with them money, connections, and technical knowledge, which the regime was happy to receive. In small towns, German-speaking communities flourished, their streets lined with bakeries and churches that felt like home. Yet behind the facades of normal life, a quiet unease persisted. Neighbors whispered about the strangers who avoided photographs and spoke little of their past. From the cafes of Buenos Aires to the foothills of Patagonia, rumors spread of men who had commanded camps, led massacres, and now lived as farmers or engineers. Some had changed everything except their convictions.
They still believed the Reich would rise again in another form in another time. The ideology had crossed the ocean along with its fugitives. Meanwhile, the Cold War was reshaping the moral map of the world. Intelligence agencies on both sides began to see former SS officers not as criminals but as assets. Their knowledge of espionage, logistics, and anti-state operations made them valuable in a new kind of war. Files that once condemned them were quietly reclassified. Names that had been marked for prosecution were suddenly protected. Governments that had once sworn to bring every war criminal to justice found it convenient to forget the pursuit of ideology had been replaced by the pursuit of advantage. The same men who had built a machinery of terror now advised on how to fight communism. The line between justice and necessity blurred, and once again bureaucracy provided its own absolution. The silence of the archives grew deeper. Some secrets were not buried. They were preserved for the survivors and their children. This silence was unbearable. They watched as the world rebuilt itself and the ghosts of those it had failed to punish. In Israel, the founding of a new nation gave memory a voice, and the hunt for the unpunished became part of its moral fabric. Newspapers published photographs of the wanted, urging witnesses to come forward. Slowly, the stories returned to public attention, not through governments, but through conscience. Survivors recognized faces in old newsreels. Neighbors recalled accents that did not belong, and each fragment of memory became a weapon against forgetting. Justice was no longer the work of institutions. It had become personal. Every discovery, every name was an act of defiance against erasure. By the early 1960s, the illusion of safety for many fugitives began to crumble. The abduction of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina by Israeli agents in 1960 was a turning point. His trial in Jerusalem revealed to the world not only the scope of the SS's crimes, but also the persistence of its networks. The myth of the hidden order, the spider's web, gained new clarity. It was not merely an organization, but an idea that evil could survive by blending into the ordinary. As more arrests followed, fear spread among those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Passports were burned, addresses abandoned, identities dissolved. Yet even then some disappeared once more, moving deeper into the folds of history. The web stretched thin, but it did not break. The ghosts had learned to adapt. By the end of the decade, the pursuit had slowed, but it had not ended. Many of the men who had fled lived quietly into old age, untroubled by the past. Others were caught too late, their trials serving more as remembrance than retribution. The world had changed again, from ruins to rival superpowers, from black uniforms to grey diplomacy. But beneath it all, the shadows of the SS still moved, faint but persistent. Justice had triumphed in law, yet failed in completeness. The truth, once hidden behind documents and oceans, remained only partially uncovered. The story of the SS had not ended in 1945. It had dissolved into the air, drifting wherever denial found shelter. Evil, like smoke, does not vanish. It drifts. By 1961, the world gathered around a courtroom in Jerusalem, a room of glass, microphone, and memory. Inside sat Adolf Eichmann, a man who had once been an architect of transport schedules and death. Now, he was a prisoner behind transparent walls, facing a justice delayed but not denied. The silence that had defined the post-war years was about to break. For the first time, millions would hear the voices of those who had lived through the machinery he helped build. The trial was not just legal, it was historical, moral, and deeply human. The air was heavy with anticipation, the world uncertain whether it was prepared to listen. Cameras captured every word, broadcasting to living rooms far from the crimes they described. The courtroom became a mirror in which humanity was forced to see itself, and through that reflection, the long-denied truth began to breathe again. Eichmann's trial was a study in banality and enormity. He spoke not as a fanatic,
but as a bureaucrat, a man who claimed to have simply followed orders. His calm voice and measured tone made his crimes feel colder than fury ever could. Around him, survivors recounted the unthinkable with trembling precision. They spoke of ghettos, deportations, and the disappearance of entire families. Each testimony unfolded like a wound reopened under bright light. For many, it was the first time their suffering had been acknowledged beyond their own communities. The world, watching through screens and headlines, could no longer dismiss what had once seemed distant. The precision of legal language met the rawness of memory, and for the first time they spoke in unison. Justice was no longer abstract. It had a face, a voice, and a silence between sentences that said more than words ever could. In those weeks, the courtroom became a stage for remembrance. The witnesses stood not as prosecutors, but as survivors of history's darkest equation. Some could barely speak, pausing between breaths as memories overtook them. Others recited details with the clarity of someone who had never been allowed to forget. The judges listened in stillness, their pens moving slowly across pages. Outside, the streets of Jerusalem filled with people gathered around radios and loudspeakers. Across continents, televisions flickered with the same images, faces lined with time and grief, recounting what the world had once refused to believe. For the first time, memory crossed borders. The crimes of the SS were no longer confined to textbooks or testimonies. They were felt, seen, and understood as part of the human condition. For survivors, the trial was both liberation and torment. Speaking the truth before the world meant reliving what had nearly destroyed them. Yet in their voices, something new took shape, a collective insistence that silence would never again be protection. They spoke for the millions who could not. Their words carried not vengeance, but vindication, proof that endurance was a form of resistance. The witnesses stood, trembling, but resolute before a man who had once seen them as numbers. Their presence alone was a rebuke to the ideology that had sought to erase them. In that moment, history belonged not to the executioners, but to the survivors. Their stories became the architecture of remembrance, built from fragments of pain that no regime could destroy. The world changed as those stories spread. Newspapers filled their pages with testimony. Classrooms began to speak of names once unspoken. The trial gave language to what had long been avoided. It made the unimaginable visible. For the first time, children learned of the camps not as rumor, but as history. Artists, filmmakers, and writers began to grapple with what humanity had done to itself. Museums were planned, memorials envisioned, lessons drafted for generations not yet born. What had been whispered in private became part of public conscience. Even those who had preferred denial found themselves listening, however uneasily. The silence that had settled over Europe after 1945 had finally begun to crack, and through those fractures, light returned. Yet the trial was not without unease. Some questioned whether justice could ever match the magnitude of such crimes. Others feared that the spectacle of judgment risked turning horror into theater. But for most, those doubts mattered less than the act of witnessing itself. The world had to see, and in seeing had to reckon. The execution of Eichmann in 1962 was not the end of the story. It was its echo. It marked a moment when justice and history briefly touched hands, neither fully satisfying the other, but both refusing to let go. The crimes had not ended with his death, but the era of silence had. From that day forward, remembrance had a moral weight that could not be denied. The trial had transformed justice into memory and memory into warning. In the years that followed, more trials came, smaller, quieter, but no less significant. Each revealed how far the SS's shadow had reached, how many had built their lives upon its silence. Some faced judgment, many did not. Yet, even the unpunished could no longer hide behind ignorance. Their names, once whispered in exile, now appeared in print. The survivors' testimonies became part of the historical record. Their words preserved not for vengeance, but for truth. The process of justice had turned into the practice of remembrance. The world's conscience, once dormant, was learning to remain awake. History was no longer written by victors or criminals alone. It was spoken by those who had endured both. By the 1970s, the televised image of the glass courtroom had become an emblem, collective awareness. Generations who had not lived through the war grew up, watching and listening, learning that evil was not distant but possible. The trial had proven that history could be both evidence and emotion, that justice could live beyond its verdict. The ghosts of the past had not vanished. They had spoken, and their voices had changed the world. The SS had built an empire of silence. Its victims had turned silence into testimony. From that transformation, humanity rediscovered its fragile conscience. The age of denial had ended, replaced by the duty to remember. The ghosts began to speak, and the world could no longer look away. By the late 20th century, the traces of the SS had faded from sight, but not from soil. Europe had grown over its wounds, with grass and memory. Yet beneath the quiet earth, remnants still stirred. Old foundations emerged from forests that had reclaimed them. The outlines of walls marking where barbed wire once stood. In Poland, Germany, and the Baltics, archaeologists, teachers, and survivors' descendants began to return to these forgotten spaces. They carried maps yellowed with age, trying to match their fragile lines to the landscape. Where once there had been commands and footfalls, now there was silence and bird song. Nature had resumed its rhythm, but the ground remained restless. The air seemed thicker in these places, as if it still held the breath of the unburied. The SS had sought to erase their crimes with fire and rubble, yet history persisted in fragments. Time had covered the evidence, but not the meaning. The 1980s brought a renewed search for understanding. Generations born after the war began asking questions their parents had avoided. Schools introduced lessons once considered too painful to teach. Television and documentaries carried images of the camps into homes that had never seen. Visitors walked through empty barracks, listening to the sound of their own footsteps. Museums rose beside ruins, not to glorify, but to bear witness. The artifacts they displayed were small: a shoe, a notebook, a rusted key. Yet they spoke with more power than any speech. Historians collected these fragments, building narratives from what had survived destruction. Their work was quiet, precise, and reverent, an act of reconstruction, not of walls, but of memory. Through them, history began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, and with purpose. In Germany, the confrontation with the past deepened into something more honest. The nation that had once built monuments to power now built memorials to sorrow. Sites once avoided were preserved as open wounds, left visible so that forgetting would be impossible. The old SS training grounds at Welsburg became museums of reflection, their halls filled with exhibits on ideology and its consequences. Former camps were declared memorial sites where the living came to stand before the void left by the dead. The language of remembrance grew from denial into dialogue. School children came by the thousands, guided not by guilt, but by the need to understand. The ruins became classrooms, not of bricks and mortar, but of conscience. The past was no longer something to escape. It had become something to endure. Elsewhere, new discoveries brought old truths to light. Hidden burial sites were unearthed by farmers and builders who had not known what lay beneath their fields. Local communities began to reckon with histories they had inherited without consent. In small towns, memorial plaques appeared on walls once silent. The names engraved were not those of heroes, but of victims. Each name became a restoration of identity, a defiance of the US's systematic erasure. Survivors, now elderly, returned to these places, sometimes walking the paths they had last seen as children. They came not for closure, for there could be none, but for confirmation that memories still lived where so many had been silenced. Their visits turned the landscapes of death into sanctuaries of remembrance. The act of walking there became a kind of prayer. Historians armed with notebooks and restraint traced the lines between ideology and infrastructure. They studied how belief had become bureaucracy, how obedience had built an empire of suffering. Their work often led them to quiet forests and crumbling bunkers, where the echoes of orders still seemed to linger. They photographed inscriptions, catalogued relics, and preserved the faint traces of what the SS had left behind. Many found themselves overcome, not by horror, but by stillness, the weight of absence heavier than any ruin. The objects they uncovered were simple: a spoon, a button, a child's toy. Yet, each carried within it the enormity of what had been lost. Through their dedication, history became less about dates and more about memory, the fragile bridge between the living and the dead. By the 1990s, remembrance had become part of Europe's moral landscape. Governments funded museums and research centers. Memorial days were established across nations once divided by ideology. Survivors' testimonies were recorded on film, their faces projected onto walls for future generations. Children placed stones on memorial walls where flowers could not grow. The act of remembrance evolved into ritual, not of mourning alone, but of vigilance. The ruins of SS buildings left to crumble became deliberate reminders of impermanence. Their decay was not neglect, but symbol proof that power fades while memory endures. Where once there had been commands shouted in darkness, there was now silence filled with learning. The past had found its guardians in the present, yet even in remembrance, unease remained. Some questioned how to balance education with reverence, history with healing. Tourism began to touch sacred ground, raising uncomfortable questions about how suffering should be seen. Scholars debated the boundaries between commemoration and spectacle, but despite these tensions, the work continued. Memory, after all, was not perfection. It was persistence. The SS had sought to build an order eternal. What endured, instead, were the ruins of their ambition and the remembrance of their cruelty. In every photograph restored, in every archive opened, the myth of their purity dissolved further. Time, it seemed, had joined the side of the witnesses. As the century turned, the ruins of the SS stood quietly beneath falling snow. Their walls cracked, their insignia eroded, yet their presence remained undeniable. Children walked where soldiers once stood, their laughter mingling with wind through wire. Birds nested in watchtowers, nature reclaiming what
ideology had desecrated. The memorial stones, weathered but unmoved, bore silent testimony to what the world had learned at such a cost. Historians still visited these places, their footsteps careful, their words few. For them, the ruins were not relics of evil, but lessons in endurance, proof that even silence can speak. The forests had grown back, but the ground beneath them still remembered. The stones remember what men tried to forget. By the dawn of the new millennium, the past began to move again, not in history books, but in symbols reborn. The black sun, the twin lightning bolts, the rhetoric of strength and purity, all found new life. In places once thought too modern to harbor them, the internet became the quiet archive of ideology, unbound by geography or shame. Forums, message boards, and later social media allowed ideas that had died in ruins to return as digital ghosts. The SS, once a relic of horror, was being mythologized by those too young to remember and too distant to understand. Their fascination was not born of history, but of rebellion, ignorance, and alienation. Images once feared were rebranded as icons of power. The language of hate, adapted to memes and slogans, disguised as irony, but driven by the same old hunger for belonging and control. What had once required parades and uniforms now spread in pixels and whispers. History had gone quiet, and in the quiet, the myth began to stir. Educators and historians watched this resurgence with alarm. They recognized that ignorance was not always accidental. Sometimes it was chosen in classrooms and universities. Teachers saw symbols scratched into desks, words of denial written in notebooks, the old narratives of superiority now repackaged for the digital age began to circulate among the disenchanted. Young people drawn by the aesthetics of rebellion found themselves entangled in rhetoric designed to seduce. Through simplicity, communities formed, where grievance became doctrine, and anger turned into belonging. The myth of the SS, stripped of its reality, offered the illusion of order in a chaotic world. Teachers fought back with truth, not dramatic but persistent. Lessons became acts of resistance. Education the antidote to infection. Yet even truth, they found, struggled to compete with the speed of deception. The classroom had become a battlefield between memory and myth. Sociologists began tracing the patterns of this revival, seeing in it a reflection of deeper unrest. The world had entered an age of uncertainty, economic instability, cultural fragmentation, and a crisis of identity. In such soil, the old seeds of extremism found room to grow once more. The SS had offered belonging through obedience. The modern extremists promised empowerment through anger. The vocabulary had changed, but the emotion remained the same. Conspiracy theories replaced propaganda. Algorithms amplified prejudice, and history became a tool for manipulation. Those who had once studied the SS as a relic of the past began to realize it had become a case study for the present. The machinery of belief had evolved, more invisible, but no less effective. And while the world no longer marched beneath banners, it still gathered under shared delusions. The digital echo of the old order could be heard if one listened closely enough. Meanwhile, survivors and their descendants watched with unease as their history became a stage for distortion. The same symbols that had once marked persecution were now worn as rebellion. Holocaust denial moved from the fringe to the feed, dressed in the language of skepticism. The enormity of the crime was reduced to argument. Its victims turned into statistics debated by strangers who had never touched the soil of a camp. Memory, once preserved in books and film, now
competed with misinformation in the speed of a scroll. For survivors, each falsehood felt like a second erasure. They spoke once more in classrooms, in interviews, in fading voices recorded for the generations to come. Their testimonies became both shield and warning. Truth they knew was fragile, not because it could be destroyed, but because it could be drowned in noise. The past had not returned. It had simply been repackaged. Across Europe and the Americas, marches began to reappear. Small at first, they grew louder. Their chants carrying echoes of old slogans, reshaped for new times. Flags bearing distorted emblems fluttered again, and faces lit by torches appeared on screens. Around the world, what had once been confined to history had stepped into the present, its confidence unshaken by memory. Governments condemned it, society debated it, but the truth remained. Hatred, once organized by a state, could now organize itself. The legacy of the SS no longer required uniforms. It needed only belief. The images of 1940s Europe began to overlap with those of the 21st century. Different settings, same illusion. Beneath the chants and anger lay the same ancient promise that strength justifies cruelty and unity excuses. Conscience, history, it seemed, had learned to slowly. In response, educators and activists turned remembrance into action. Museums evolved into digital archives, adapting to the speed of misinformation. Documentaries streamed online, testimonies subtitled in dozens of languages. Virtual tours allowed classrooms to walk the paths of the camps without leaving their cities. Survivors' stories became accessible with a single click, their words outlasting their lifetimes. Teachers no longer simply taught, they defended history itself. Their lessons were no longer about the past, but about vigilance, the awareness that evil often returns disguised as ordinary. Conviction, the act of remembering, became both sacred and strategic. The SS had built its empire on control of truth. Now truth had learned to fight back, and in that quiet defiance, the lessons of history began to glow once more. For those who study extremism today, the line between remembrance and recurrence has grown perilously thin. Every era, they argue, believes itself immune until it isn't. The fascination with power, purity, and belonging remains as timeless as the warnings against them. History does not repeat itself perfectly. It adapts to new forms of communication and crisis. The SS survives not as an institution, but as a symbol, a myth that thrives when knowledge wanes. The challenge for the modern world is not to destroy the myth, but to understand it so deeply that it loses its allure. Awareness must be inherited, not assumed. Each generation must relearn the fragility of decency and the ease with which it can be betrayed. The past does not demand guilt, only vigilance. In the quiet spaces of remembrance, classrooms, museums, and memorials, the lessons of the SS endure. They are not merely warnings from history, but mirrors of the present. The ruins of ideology remain visible not in monuments, but in minds. Teachers erase symbols from desks. Students light candles at walls of names. The contrast between ignorance and empathy continues its quiet struggle. Day after day, the world has not forgotten, but it has grown restless, distracted, vulnerable to the comfort of myth. Yet for every lie repeated, a truth still stands in defiance. History remains the voice that reminds us where certainty leads when it loses its soul. The shadows whisper still, and each generation must learn to listen. In the quiet homes of modern Europe, the past still waits in drawers, and attics. Boxes filled with letters, medals, and faded uniforms rest beneath the dust of generations. For decades, they remained untouched, family secrets wrapped in silence. But, as grandchildren grew into historians of their own bloodlines, those boxes began to open. What they found were in OT, relics, but reckonings, photographs of men in uniform, documents bearing insignias long outlawed, letters signed in careful German script. These discoveries blurred the line between history and inheritance. The war, that had seemed distant in textbooks, became deeply personal. The faces in the photographs looked familiar. The same eyes, the same hands, the same name. The realization arrived quietly, heavy and irreversible. The past once thought conquered had come home again across Germany, Austria, and beyond. A new generation began asking questions their parents had avoided. The children of silence became the keepers of truth. Some found their ancestors among the perpetrators, others among the victims, many among the bystanders who chose neither. Museums and universities offered programs for descendants to explore their family archives. The act of uncovering became both painful and necessary. To know was to inherit burden, but also the responsibility to remember. These stories were no longer about abstract evil, but about people, fathers who followed orders, mothers who looked away, neighbors who complied. Their grandchildren sought not absolution, but understanding. They discovered that memory could wound even those who had not lived the events themselves. Yet, through that wound, empathy entered, and history became human again. The letters told stories that history books could not. They revealed affection, confusion, and conviction tangled within the same lines. Some described loyalty to a cause that now seemed monstrous. Others betrayed quiet doubts written too late to matter. One letter might end with a signature of devotion to the Führer, another with a plea for forgiveness, never sent. These fragments spoke not only of ideology, but of humanity's capacity to believe and obey. Reading them, descendants faced a haunting paradox: to love their ancestors while condemning their actions. It was a tension that could not be resolved, only acknowledged. The ink on those pages carried both love and complicity, grief and denial. Through them, the grandchildren met not heroes or villains, but human beings who had been consumed by history's storm. It was not comfort they found, but clarity. Some chose to share these discoveries publicly. Documentaries, memoirs, and interviews began to appear. Personal confessions woven into national narratives. A granddaughter's trembling voice recounting her grandfather's role in a concentration camp. A son tracing his family name through archives, once sealed by shame. Each story became a piece of collective healing, confronting not just what had been done, but what had been hidden. The process was never easy. Some families fractured over denial. Others came closer through honesty. The silence that had protected generations from pain was finally breaking. It revealed that memory was not a chain, but a bridge, one that led not backward, but forward through understanding. Confronting the past was not about guilt, but about truth finding its way home. In classrooms, teachers began inviting descendants to speak, to humanize the lessons of history. Students listened not to distant lectures, but to the tremor in a voice, remembering a family secret. The story of the SS ceased to be only a political narrative.
It became a personal inheritance shared across bloodlines. Some found redemption in activism, dedicating their lives to education and reconciliation. Others found quiet solace in acknowledgement alone. The next generation learned that history does not only live in archives, it lives in names, in gestures, in the silence that follows a difficult question. The past had become a shared moral terrain where memory replaced accusation and empathy replaced denial. Through this process, the wounds of history began to scar, visible but healing. Psychologists began studying this generational echo, the way trauma and guilt could ripple through time. They found that silence, like memory, could be inherited. Families that had never spoken of the war carried unspoken tensions as if the past had rewritten their DNA. The grandchildren of perpetrators often shared the same symptoms as those of survivors: anxiety, shame, sleeplessness, a need for meaning. In confronting the past, they were confronting themselves. This realization transformed remembrance into something deeper, a recognition that history was not only collective, but intimate. Healing, they learned, was not forgetting. It was the courage to look inward without turning away. Through that gaze, the distance between victim and descendant grew smaller. Humanity, fractured by ideology, began to find its reflection again. Public memory followed this transformation. Memorials grew quieter, more personal. Instead of grand monuments, there were now small brass plaques embedded in sidewalks, pristine or stumbling stones, each bearing a name, a date, fate. Passers-by would stop, bow, and remember. History had moved from the walls of museums to the very streets where it had unfolded. Descendants placed candles beside these stones, not to absolve, but to connect. Each flame was a reminder that remembrance had become a living act. The SS had sought to build an eternal order through destruction. What endured instead was a network of remembrance that spanned generations. The weight of memory was heavy, but it was also sacred. It bound the present to its conscience. As the 21st century unfolded, the grandchildren became the elders, and their children inherited a quieter world, one built not on denial, but on reflection. The past no longer felt like a distant warning, but a living presence guiding the moral compass of nations. In the attics and archives, the boxes remain, but their meaning has changed. They are no longer symbols of shame, but of awareness, reminders that truth once faced cannot be buried again. The families that once hid their history now preserve it with care. Across generations, the story of the SS has transformed from horror into heritage, not to be honored, but to be understood. History breathes through bloodlines and asks to be remembered, not repeated. By the early 21st century, the words "never again" had become more than a vow. They had become a duty, carried by nations, educators, and survivors alike. Across the world, memorials rose not as monuments to victory, but as guardians of memory. In Poland, the gates of Auschwitz still stood, their iron letters unchanged, their silence undisturbed. Visitors walked through in quiet lines, guided not by curiosity, but by reverence. The ground beneath their feet was heavy, as if history itself resisted being walked upon. Survivors, now frail and few, led to with voices that trembled, yet endured. Their words were not rehearsed, but remembered, fragments of a truth that could not die with them. Schools from distant continents brought their students here, teaching not geography or politics, but humanity. The lessons of the SS had become the moral curriculum of the modern world. The crimes that
once sought to erase identity, had instead defined the global conscience. Around the globe, remembrance found form in classrooms, memorial halls, and moments of silence. The Holocaust became not only a chapter of history, but a warning engraved into collective understanding. Educators taught beyond dates and numbers. They taught empathy, responsibility, and vigilance. They explained how ordinary men driven by belief and obedience had built systems capable of annihilation. They reminded students that evil was not born in monsters, but in the quiet choices of people who looked away. Each generation learned that memory was not merely a record of suffering, it was the foundation of malady itself. Museums displayed artifacts that spoke softly, but powerfully. A shoe, a diary, a name, written on a scrap of paper. These were not objects of horror, but of endurance. They made the abstract real, the unimaginable visible, and in every lesson, the shadow of the SS served as both warning and mirror. The survivors became the teachers of the world. As they aged, their testimonies grew more precious, their words more deliberate. They spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity, an unbroken link between the living and the dead. Through their memories, the enormity of the SS's crimes was no longer distant or academic. It was human, fragile, and immediate. They recounted not just what was lost, but how it had been allowed to happen. In their eyes, forgiveness and remembrance lived side by side, not as contradictions, but as necessities. Many dedicated their final years to education, determined that the truth would not fade when they were gone. Their stories were recorded in film, translated into dozens of languages, preserved in digital archives for generations yet unborn. Each testimony was a spark against forgetting, and in those sparks, the light of moral understanding continued to burn. Nations, too, began to formalize remembrance. Days of commemoration were established, not to mourn the past, but to affirm the future. Governments pledged to confront hate wherever it appeared, whether on the streets or in the rhetoric of power. The European Union, the United Nations, and countless local communities reaffirmed the commitment that remembrance demanded that atrocity begins in apathy and prevention begins in education. Yet even these institutions understood that remembrance was fragile. The world, though watchful, was not immune to repetition. Wars still raged and prejudice still found new voices. But the difference was awareness, a shared understanding that silence was no longer an option. In that understanding lay the truest legacy of remembrance, not perfection, but vigilance. Artists, filmmakers, and writers continued to give shape to the memory of the Holocaust, each generation finding new language for the same unending truth. Through their work, the story of the SS ceased to be only a German tragedy. It became a human, on films brought the images of the camps to living rooms. Novels explored the psychology of complicity. Memorial installations transformed absence into presence. These expressions of art did not seek to reimagine history, but to keep it breathing. Each new portrayal reminded the world that remembrance required imagination, not to distort the past, but to protect it from decay. The act of creation became an act of resistance, a refusal to allow evil to vanish beneath the dust of familiarity. Memory, they taught, is not static. It must be renewed or it will be lost. In schools across continents, young students stood at memorials reading names aloud. The lists were endless. their cadence hypnotic, the meaning profound. Each name spoken aloud became an act of resurrection, a defiance against the anonymity that the SS had imposed. Teachers spoke softly as they explained that the Holocaust was not a single event, but the consequence of human weakness repeated at scale. The lessons extended beyond the classroom, urging compassion, responsibility, and courage in the face of intolerance. For many, the visit to a memorial was a turning point. The moment history became personal, they left not with guilt, but with understanding that remembrance is not about blame, but about awareness. Each generation carried the lesson forward like a candle passed from trembling hand to steady one. The memorial sites themselves aged, their bricks crumbling, their iron rusting, yet their message remained unchanged. Time had transformed them from scenes of horror into sanctuaries of reflection. The names carved into stone, the photographs behind glass, the quiet corridors, all spoke of endurance, not despair. The world had turned these places into mirrors, asking not only what happened, but how it could happen again. The answer always lay in the human heart, in prejudice, obedience, and fear, but also in resilience, empathy, and the power to change. The ruins of the SS were no longer symbols of power. They were monuments to fragility, to the eternal need for conscience in the face of history's temptations. In the present day, remembrance continues not as ritual, but as resistance. Survivors pass their stories to educators, educators to students, students to the future. The chain of memory holds firm, each link strengthened by understanding rather than guilt. The phrase "never again" has become both warning and prayer, a promise written in ash carried by the living. The SS sought to create an empire that would last 1,000 years. Instead, it left behind a lesson that will last far longer. The world that once turned away now kneels in remembrance, not to relive the horror, but to guard against its return. Memory has become humanity's last defense against indifference. To remember is not to dwell, it is to guard the light. The wind moves through the empty halls of what were once SS barracks, carrying the faint echo of footsteps that no longer exist. The walls, stripped of insignia and purpose, still seem to hold a kind of memory, not of glory, but of command. The rooms are hollow, the air heavy with the weight of silence. Here the machinery of belief once hummed with precision, its rhythm guided by orders and obedience. Now only dust remains, drifting where words of loyalty once filled the air. Snow gathers on the windowsills, softening the outlines of what history has left behind. Time has reclaimed these spaces, but not their meaning. Each corridor feels like a question unanswered. The past no longer speaks and shouts. It whispers through absence. In this stillness, the echo of what humanity once became lingers like a faint heartbeat beneath the floorboards. The silence is not peace. It is remembrance learning how to breathe. The SS was more than an institution. It was a reflection of human obedience, turned into system. Its creation was not an accident of politics, but the deliberate shaping of belief into action. Men and women built it with conviction, thinking they were serving a higher order of discipline, loyalty, and faith. In their search for purpose, they surrendered the one thing that made them free: the ability to question. The transformation of moral individuals into instruments of ideology did not begin with hatred but with duty. That is the truth history continues to wrestle with. The SS stands as a monument to how easily obedience can disguise itself as virtue. Within its ranks, malady was rewritten as service, and conscience became an obstacle. The result was not just death,
but the quiet death of thought. What remains today is not just their history, but the reminder of how fragile conviction can be when unexamined. Humanity's capacity for destruction begins not in rage, but in silence. The ruins of their order still exist in archives and memories, preserved not to accuse, but to warn. Their structure, their rituals, their meticulous records, all reveal a pattern more terrifying than chaos, the efficiency of evil. It did not rely madness or passion, but on organization. Every command was followed, every number counted, every death justified as a necessity. The men of the SS saw themselves as engineers of destiny, their obedience a form of faith. Yet in the end, it was that same obedience that erased their humanity. To study them is to study the dark potential of systems built on certainty. When individuals dissolve into institutions, responsibility becomes diffused, and conscience disappears. This perhaps is the echo that haunts the modern world. Not their ideology, but their precision. The lesson left behind is not only moral, but mechanical. How easily a structure of order can conceal the heart of horror. As time moves further from those years, the memory of the SS becomes less about the men themselves and more about what they revealed. Their story has transformed from history into reflection, from record into warning. The faces in old photographs have blurred, but the patterns they embodied remain familiar. In every age, there are those who promise security in exchange for surrender, who elevate obedience above thought. The symbols change, but the hunger for certainty remains. What the SS proved is that ideology, once sanctified, can make the unthinkable seem necessary. The uniform does not create evil, it only gives it form. Each generation that studies them confronts not the past, but the mirror of its own potential. The question is no longer how such things happened, it is whether we would recognize their beginnings in ourselves. At memorials scattered across Europe, the landscape of memory endures in quiet dignity. Snow falls over stone plaques, candles flicker beside names etched into glass. The air is still, the silence immense. Visitors walk slowly, their breaths visible in the cold, their thoughts heavy with what words cannot convey. In places like Dachau and Auschwitz, time feels suspended, the present and past existing side by side. Each brick, each rail, each gate has become a witness. The SS, once powerful beyond imagination, now exists only as a warning beneath the weight of these stones. The cruelty that once seemed infinite has been reduced to fragments of remembrance, and yet in every memorial there is an unspoken truth that memory itself is fragile and must be tended like a flame. Forgetting is not forgiveness. Silence, if unguarded, can become permission once more. Philosophers and theologians have long tried to explain what the SS represents in the story of humanity. Some see them as proof of evil's banality, ordinary men obeying extraordinary wrongs. Others see them as a symptom of faith misplaced in ideology rather than compassion. But beyond interpretation lies something simpler, something quieter. The SS showed that morality cannot survive abstraction. When belief becomes detached from empathy, it ceases to be moral at all. Their legacy teaches that obedience is never neutral. It always serves something, and what it serves defines the soul of a society. That is why remembrance is not merely about mourning the victims, but about confronting capacity within all people to obey without question. The SS was not an anomaly of history. It was a reflection of what happens when conscience yields
to command. The echo of that surrender still shapes the silence of our world. Today, the barracks are museums, the archives are public, and the names of the fallen are read aloud in schools. Children trace the letters of history, carved into walls their ancestors once feared. Teachers explain that remembrance is not about guilt, but about guardianship. The sound of their voices replaces the orders that once filled these same rooms. The transformation of those spaces from command posts to classrooms is itself a kind of redemption. It shows that memory can triumph over ideology and that the lessons written in ash can still bear light. Each generation inherits the same question: how to balance obedience with conscience, order with humanity. The past cannot answer it, but it demands that we keep asking. The ruins remind us that remembrance is not static. It is a living dialogue between what was and what must never be again. As the wind moves once more through the empty corridors, the silence deepens into understanding. The SS is gone, their symbols outlawed, their empire dissolved into history. Yet the echo of obedience remains, faint but persistent. It lingers not in uniforms or slogans, but in the human heart's temptation to submit to certainty. That is where history waits, not in books, but in choices. The barracks crumble, the archives fade, but the lesson endures. That power without conscience becomes worship, and obedience without question becomes surrender. The story of the SS ends not in fire, but in warning. It asks nothing of us except awareness. The uniforms are gone. The echo remains, waiting for those who dare not listen.